In the bustling streets of London, under the dimming lights of dusk, Richard Alton stood by a worn-out bench, his silhouette almost blending into the gritty urban landscape. The usual markers of his status, the crisp, tailored suits, gleaming shoes, and refined composure, were nowhere in sight. Instead, his clothes were tattered and layered as if picked up from the remnants of a thrift store, his face bearing faint lines of dirt, his once carefully combed hair disheveled. Tonight, he was far from the world of sprawling estates and business meetings. Tonight, he was a stranger in his own city, masking himself in the appearance of a man with no home. Richard's sharp gaze scanned the crowd, subtly darting to the faces that passed by, barely acknowledging his presence. He waited, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, fingers tingling in the damp evening chill. Every now and then, he checked his watch, an old, tarnished piece he'd found in a forgotten drawer, just to complete the disguise. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on the purpose of this charade. He was here. Hello, viewer. Thank you for being here. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. Now let's continue with the story. He was here to meet Emily, a young woman who had quickly become the most important figure in his son Thomas's life. Richard's son had introduced her as the one, his voice brimming with excitement that bordered on the naive. Though Richard loved his son dearly, he couldn't shake off the nagging doubts about Emily. Thomas was a good-hearted, well-mannered young man, raised with the privileges Richard's success had afforded him. But wealth could attract the wrong kind of attention, and Richard had seen it firsthand too many times. As he settled into his role, sitting hunched on the bench, he couldn't help but feel an odd mix of anticipation and dread. He had crafted this encounter with precision, determined to observe her without the filter of his wealth or family name. He wanted to see how she would treat a stranger, a man society would ignore or even scorn. Richard knew the plan was unconventional, even somewhat devious, but the worry that gnawed at him was stronger than any sense of decency or propriety. His own painful experiences with people who had betrayed his trust had taught him that sometimes those closest to you could be the most dangerous. He couldn't bear the thought of Thomas being blindsided by someone who might love his fortune more than his heart. As he sat there, he felt a pang of guilt. He knew Thomas wouldn't understand, that if his son discovered this scheme, it would likely create a chasm between them. Yet he pressed forward, convincing himself that this was necessary. This was love, he reasoned, albeit a harsh, protective love that often misunderstood boundaries. The minutes ticked by, and Richard's fingers drummed rhythmically on the bench's edge, a nervous habit he hadn't realized he still had. His eyes scanned the street again, looking for any sign of Emily. This neighborhood wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented. The faint smell of diesel mixed with street food lingered in the air, and neon lights from nearby shops blinked erratically, casting strange shadows. He felt out of place, and the discomfort began to gnaw at his patience. Finally, he saw her, walking towards him, her pace slow, her head slightly lowered as if she were lost in thought. She was wrapped in a warm, fashionable coat, her hair tucked behind her ears, and a soft scarf around her neck. She looked as if she belonged in a scene painted by a romantic artist, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. As she approached, he felt his heart quicken. Would she notice him? Would she stop? With a practiced slouch, he lowered his gaze, pretending to fumble with his coat's torn pocket, trying to look every bit the weary man who had faced too many nights on the streets. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched her, his body tense, bracing for her reaction. As lights dimmed around him and the chill of the evening seeped into his bones, Richard's mind drifted, unbidden, to the opulence of the life he'd crafted over the decades. The sprawling estates, the lavish dinner parties, the elegantly manicured gardens. It was all a far cry from this cold bench in a neighborhood he had never visited before. His wealth had allowed him, and by extension his son Thomas, access to things that most could only dream of. But none of that protected his family from the dark undercurrents he knew all too well, the hidden motivations that often lurked behind a smile or a soft-spoken compliment. He glanced down at his fingers, now trembling slightly, and noticed how they had taken on a roughness from the day's work. A small layer of dust coated his palms, the grime settling into the lines that once felt clean and smooth. For all of his son's life, Richard had ensured that neither Thomas nor his late wife, Margaret, had to worry about the difficulties he'd faced in his own early years. Yet, as he sat there, he wondered if he'd inadvertently shielded Thomas too well, leaving him vulnerable to the very kind of person Richard now suspected Emily to be. When Thomas had introduced Emily to him for the first time, Richard's instincts had stirred, a protective, almost primal wariness that he couldn't shake. Emily had seemed pleasant enough, with her quick laughter and seemingly genuine warmth. But Richard's reservations ran deeper than mere first impressions. He had observed her closely at family gatherings, in quiet moments over dinner, trying to gauge if her affection for Thomas was as sincere as it appeared to be. Thomas, now in his late 20s, was an only child, the center of Richard's world since Margaret's passing nearly 10 years ago. Unlike Richard, who had clawed his way up from nothing, Thomas had grown up in a world of privilege. Yet, against the odds, he had maintained a down-to-earth nature, surprising even Richard with his refusal to lean on the family fortune. The boy had insisted on working his way up in his own career, choosing to teach at a local school rather than join his father in the high-stakes world of business. In many ways, Thomas's grounded approach had only intensified Richard's protective instincts. He felt a responsibility to shield his son from the ruthlessness of the world, from the very pitfalls he had experienced himself. But love, Richard knew, could be a particularly dangerous blind spot. It could deceive even the most discerning, transforming a seemingly genuine affection into a web of manipulation. The thought of Thomas being taken advantage of filled Richard with a cold determination. He couldn't allow his son to become another casualty of the predatory ambitions he'd seen so often in his own world. And so, he had resolved to test Emily, to observe her outside of the comfortable trappings of their family's wealth and status. It was an unusual plan, he knew, unorthodox, even questionable, but it was born from a lifetime of experiences, from betrayals and disappointments that had shaped him in ways Thomas would never understand. Richard had learned the hard way that money could warp people's true intentions. He had been burned before, trusting those who only valued him for what he could give, not for who he was. Yet, for all his efforts to distance himself emotionally, he couldn't help but feel a slight unease about his plan. What if he was wrong about her? What if Emily truly did care for Thomas, as she appeared to? The thought gnawed at him, a sliver of doubt that he quickly brushed aside. Better to err on the side of caution, he told himself, than to leave his son vulnerable to heartbreak. If Emily was genuine, she would pass this test, he reasoned. And if she wasn't, well, better to find out now than after any vows had been exchanged. As he sat there, lost in thought, a memory surfaced, one that he hadn't revisited in years. He recalled a young woman he had known before he met Margaret, a woman he had trusted deeply. They had grown close, and he had foolishly believed her feelings were genuine. It wasn't until he caught her rifling through his documents, looking for information on his finances, that he realized the depth of her deception. The sting of that betrayal had stayed with him, shaping his view of relationships, of love, of trust. Richard's chest tightened, and he forced himself to breathe, trying to shake off the heaviness that had settled over him. This wasn't about his past or his own mistakes. This was about Thomas, about ensuring that his son wouldn't have to learn these lessons the hard way. He had resolved to see this test through, no matter the personal discomfort it caused him. The evening continued to darken, and the streets grew quieter, the last remnants of daylight fading into the London skyline. His fingers ached from the cold, but he remained seated, waiting, knowing that any moment now, Emily would appear. He imagined her reaction if she discovered his true identity, the bitterness she might feel if she knew he had gone to such lengths. But that, he reminded himself, was a risk he was willing to take. This was about safeguarding his son's future, even if it meant sacrificing his own peace of mind. Richard adjusted himself on the cold bench, his body tense with anticipation. The streetlights began to cast a soft glow over the pavement, and he leaned forward, hoping to see Emily approach. The neighborhood was quieter now, with fewer people passing by. Just as he wondered if she would show up at all, he spotted her. She walked toward him at a steady pace, her head slightly bowed, the heels of her boots tapping rhythmically against the stone path. She was wrapped in a warm coat, her scarf pulled close to shield her from the evening's chill. Richard observed her intently, his heart pounding. Emily looked every bit the composed, gentle person she had always appeared to be. She moved gracefully, unaware that she was being watched. Her gaze swept over the area around her, but she hadn't yet noticed the man slumped on the bench, looking nothing like the father of her boyfriend. Richard tightened his posture, letting his shoulders droop, eyes fixed on the ground. He did his best to appear small, vulnerable, and overlooked, someone people would usually ignore. As she came closer, Richard dared a quick glance at her face, studying her expression. She didn't recognize him, of course, but he noticed her eyes soften as they landed on him. There was no judgment or discomfort, just a quiet concern as her gaze lingered on him a moment longer than it might on any other passerby. For an instant, Richard felt his resolve waver. She looked genuine, truly concerned, and it unsettled him, but he quickly reminded himself of his purpose. One moment of kindness didn't reveal someone's true character. Emily continued walking, and for a tense second, Richard thought she might pass by without a word. He clenched his fists, bracing for disappointment, but then she paused, hesitating as her eyes returned to him. Richard held his breath, sensing the struggle within her. She looked around, perhaps aware of the social norms that often deter people from engaging with strangers, particularly those who seemed down on their luck. Then, with a small sigh, Emily took a step closer. Her hesitation melted into resolve as she spoke, her voice gentle and steady. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of genuine empathy that caught Richard off guard. He looked up, feigning a bit of surprise, and met her gaze. Her face was open and kind, showing no sign of suspicion or reluctance. Richard kept his expression guarded, as though processing her presence and trying to decide if he should respond. He noticed her hand holding the strap of her bag tightly, but there was no trace of fear or disdain. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet strength, as if bracing herself to help in whatever way she could. I'm fine," he muttered, his voice deliberately shaky. Just trying to get by." Emily didn't recoil, didn't look away, and Richard felt an odd sense of comfort in her gaze. He wasn't sure if he wanted to continue with his charade, yet he knew he had to. He lowered his eyes again, creating a barrier between them, but she didn't back away. Instead, she hesitated, then glanced down at the bag she carried. With a soft smile, she set it down and unzipped the outer pocket. From it, she pulled a small thermos. Richard's eyes widened involuntarily, and he watched as she unscrewed the lid and offered it to him. "It's just tea," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's cold out here. Thought it might help." Richard reached out, his hand unsteady as he accepted the thermos, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. The warmth of the tea seeped through the metal, and he felt a strange gratitude well up inside him. He couldn't remember the last time someone had shown him kindness without expecting something in return, but this wasn't about him. It was about Thomas, about ensuring his son's happiness. He took a cautious sip, nodding his thanks, though he kept his expression guarded. Emily didn't press him with questions or look at him with pity. She simply sat down on the edge of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. Her gaze was focused on the street in front of them, as if she was giving him space to collect his thoughts. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you don't mind me sitting here," she said. I don't know your story, but I know that sometimes just having someone nearby can make things a little easier." Richard felt a pang of guilt ripple through him. This woman, who knew nothing of his identity, was extending her warmth and compassion without hesitation. He was beginning to question the validity of his plan, feeling a strange discomfort as her kindness continued to unfold. He hadn't expected her to pass this test so easily, to act with such genuine empathy. Yet, he needed to remain focused. He couldn't let this one encounter sway his judgment. People could be complex, layered, hiding motives beneath layers of kindness. This was merely the first interaction, a single moment that might not reflect her intentions toward Thomas. Still, as he took another sip of the tea, he couldn't deny the feeling that his perception of Emily was shifting, even if only slightly. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the city forming a faint backdrop to the stillness between them. Emily seemed content just to be there, not prying, not intruding, simply offering her presence. Richard watched her out of the corner of his eye, wondering if this was the real Emily or if he was simply seeing what he wanted to see. As Emily sat beside him on the bench, Richard noticed how naturally she seemed to blend into this humble scene. There was no air of impatience or distraction in her demeanor. She seemed fully present, entirely engaged with the moment. Richard, still clutching the warm thermos of tea she had offered, allowed himself to relax, if only slightly, realizing that her presence was affecting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yet, he kept reminding himself of the purpose of his ruse, the need to see beyond any fleeting moments of kindness. Just as he was beginning to consider saying something to break the silence, a stranger, dressed in business attire and moving at a brisk pace, brushed past them, barely noticing Richard's slumped figure on the bench. The man's shoulder collided with Richard's arm, almost knocking the thermos from his grip. The impact was enough to jar him, but not nearly as surprising as what happened next. Emily's eyes widened in alarm, and without a moment's hesitation, she reached out, steadying Richard's arm. She shot the stranger a glance of quiet reproach, though he didn't bother to turn back or acknowledge the disruption he had caused. Richard noticed the small flicker of irritation on Emily's face, quickly replaced by concern as she turned back to him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hand lingering lightly on his arm for a moment longer before she withdrew it, her cheeks faintly pink with embarrassment. She seemed genuinely troubled by the incident, as though she were responsible for this random act of disregard. Her gaze was steady, her concern unmistakable, and Richard felt a pang of guilt tighten in his chest. "Yes," he stammered, momentarily forgetting to maintain the gruff, distant tone he'd adopted earlier. "Thank you, miss." He looked away quickly, trying to regain his composure, reminding himself of the task at hand. This was only the beginning. He couldn't let his guard down yet, not even in the face of Emily's empathy. Emily's hand had returned to her lap, but her expression remained thoughtful. She glanced down the street, her brows slightly furrowed as if weighing a decision. Richard watched her closely, sensing a kind of internal struggle that intrigued him. She didn't appear to be in any hurry, nor did she seem inclined to abandon him. In fact, she seemed more anchored by the moment, as though she were making up her mind about something. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she began cautiously, her tone gentle yet filled with a quiet resolve, "but do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Her words hung in the cool evening air, genuine and unforced, and Richard found himself taken aback. There was no pity in her voice, only a simple, straightforward kindness. For a moment, Richard's carefully constructed plan wavered. He hadn't anticipated this level of compassion, especially so early in their encounter. He expected mild civility, perhaps, but not this direct interest in his well-being. It was unsettling, challenging the assumptions he had clung to about her. And yet, he needed to push forward to ensure his assumptions were either confirmed or dispelled completely. "No, not really," he replied, his voice trailing off as he tried to sound vague. I'll find somewhere." Emily seemed unsatisfied with his answer. She shifted slightly, her eyes scanning his face, searching for something deeper. "There's a shelter nearby," she offered gently. "It's not much, but it's warm, and they serve a decent meal. I can walk you there if you'd like." Richard felt his pulse quicken. He knew he had to maintain his role, to let this test unfold naturally, but her sincerity was unnerving. There was no hesitation in her offer, no sign that she was looking to rid herself of an uncomfortable situation. Instead, she seemed determined, as if guiding him to a shelter was simply the right thing to do. That's very kind of you," he murmured, lowering his gaze, partly to avoid her probing eyes and partly to hide the growing conflict within him. This encounter was beginning to unearth emotions he hadn't anticipated, feelings he had long buried under layers of cynicism and distrust. Emily's kindness felt disarming, almost unsettling, and he wasn't entirely sure how to handle it. Their brief conversation was interrupted by a passerby, a woman with a hurried step and an air of disdain. She cast a quick, disapproving glance in their direction before moving on, her expression full of unspoken judgment. Richard noticed Emily's shoulders tense slightly, but she didn't waver. Instead, she squared her posture, as if silently defending her decision to remain seated beside him. "People can be," she began, choosing her words carefully, "well, they can be unkind sometimes." She looked down at her hands, now folded neatly in her lap, her expression softening. "I'm sorry if you've had to deal with that," she added, her voice barely a whisper. Richard's mind spun with questions he couldn't voice. Here she was, a young woman of privilege, sitting on a bench with a man she believed to be homeless, extending a level of compassion he rarely encountered even in his own circles. And yet, he couldn't shake the suspicion that lingered, the thought that this could all be an act, a convenient performance. But as he looked at her, sitting with a quiet dignity and unflinching compassion, he began to doubt the necessity of this test. He was questioning the very premise of his plan, the need to put her through this ordeal. He wondered if perhaps he was being too harsh, too clouded by his own experiences to see her for who she truly was. They sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in thought, as the city moved around them, indifferent to their presence. The sounds of distant traffic and the occasional footstep filled the space between them, but Emily didn't appear anxious to leave. Instead, she seemed perfectly content to sit with him, offering her presence without expectation, without judgment. And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt a flicker of something he hadn't anticipated. A hint of admiration for this young woman who seemed to embody the very qualities he had nearly lost faith in. Emily shifted on the bench beside Richard, casting him a quick, thoughtful glance before reaching into her bag. She withdrew a small thermos, which she'd refilled from the tea she'd brought earlier, and poured a bit more into the lid for him. "I thought you might need a bit more," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. The simple gesture struck Richard, and he accepted the warm cup, wrapping his hands around it as if to absorb not just its heat, but the quiet generosity that came with it. He sipped the tea slowly, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. The longer he remained in Emily's company, the more difficult it was to maintain his role. He was used to control, to orchestrating situations with precision. Yet here, she was calmly breaking down his carefully constructed boundaries with nothing more than kindness, and it unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. Emily, meanwhile, seemed content with the silence between them, a subtle smile flickering across her face as she watched the street. After a moment, she spoke, her voice carrying a hint of vulnerability that surprised him. "You know, sometimes I think kindness is the only real thing we have to offer each other. Money, jobs, even time, all those things can change. But kindness, that's something that lives on, don't you think?" Her words caught him off guard, and he found himself nodding slowly. He hadn't considered kindness as a currency, not in years at least. To him, kindness often felt like a weakness, something people exploited. But watching Emily, he saw a strength in it, a resilience that made him rethink his judgments, if only for a moment. Richard's curiosity grew, but he reminded himself to stay guarded, to keep up his act. He mumbled a quiet, "Yes, I suppose so," and focused on finishing the tea. Yet Emily seemed unfazed by his distant responses, as if she'd already accepted him exactly as he was. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't accustomed to, and it made him feel vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. After a pause, Emily began sharing a story of her own, something that surprised him even more. "I don't think I ever told Thomas this," she started, her gaze distant, "but I grew up in a place not too different from this one. My parents didn't have much, and there were times when we struggled, really struggled. I remember one winter when we barely had enough to pay the heating bill. My mom worked 3 jobs just to make sure we had food on the table." Richard's ears perked up. This was something he hadn't anticipated, this glimpse into her past. He hadn't known much about Emily's background, just what he'd observed and what Thomas had mentioned in passing. She had seemed well-mannered, graceful, someone who fit in effortlessly with their social circle. Yet here she was, openly sharing a past that hinted at hardship and resilience. "There was this one night," she continued, her voice almost a whisper, "when my mum came home late, exhausted. She had a loaf of bread and a can of soup, and that was all we had to eat. I asked her if we were going to be okay, and she smiled the way she always did, and told me that as long as we had each other, we'd get through it." She paused, her eyes misty with memory, and Richard could feel a weight in her words that surprised him. He had always assumed her life had been simple, straightforward, but here she was, revealing a depth he hadn't anticipated. He felt an uncomfortable pang of empathy, a strange connection to her struggle. "I think about that night sometimes," she went on, "how my mom never let us see the full extent of what she was going through. She wanted us to feel safe, no matter what." She turned to him then, her eyes earnest. "That's why I believe in kindness. Because you never really know what someone else is going through. It might be the one thing that makes a difference." Richard looked away, struggling to maintain his role as the stranger she saw before her. He clenched his hands around the thermos, his mind reeling. Her story was disarming, breaking down his defenses even as he tried to reinforce them. He hadn't expected this, hadn't thought she'd open up to him, a supposed stranger, in such a vulnerable way. For a moment, he wondered if he was truly testing her or if she was, in some subtle way, testing him. The thought unsettled him, forcing him to question his own motivations, his fears. Yet he couldn't afford to let this detour his plan. He reminded himself of the doubts that had plagued him since Thomas first introduced her, the lingering suspicion that had driven him to sit on this cold bench in the first place. Emily watched him in silence for a moment, as though sensing his inner turmoil. She didn't pry or press him to speak, instead offering him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm sorry if I'm talking too much," she said, her tone light. Sometimes it's nice to share things with someone, even if they're a stranger." Her words hung in the air, poignant and genuine. Richard nodded, feeling his resolve waver as he struggled to maintain the detachment he had clung to. He wanted to dismiss her as someone who might be putting on a show, someone who could be using this empathy to mask a hidden motive. But the sincerity in her eyes, the vulnerability in her voice, it was all too real to ignore. They sat together, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them, each lost in their thoughts. For Richard, this was supposed to be a test of her character, a moment to confirm his suspicions or alleviate his fears. Yet, as he looked at her, he realized it was becoming a test of his own convictions, a confrontation with his own assumptions and biases. As they sat in silence, the cold night settled in around them, and Richard felt an uncomfortable warmth bloom in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a sensation that made him question not just Emily, but himself. For the first time, he found himself hoping that his suspicions would prove unfounded, that perhaps he had misjudged her, and that Thomas had, in fact, chosen someone who could love him for who he truly was. As Richard sat on the cold bench, clutching the thermos Emily had refilled for him, he felt the beginnings of an inner struggle that he hadn't anticipated. This was meant to be a simple test, a straightforward way to judge her sincerity. Yet, with every passing moment, he felt himself slipping, not away from his goal, but toward a growing respect for Emily. Her story had hit him deeply, revealing a side of her that he hadn't seen before, and he began to question his own intentions. For the first time, he wondered if his skepticism was misdirected, a symptom of his own guarded heart, rather than an indictment of hers. Emily, seemingly oblivious to his internal conflict, continued to sit beside him, her calm demeanor undisturbed. She didn't press him for answers, nor did she look at him with the slightest trace of judgment. Instead, she leaned back slightly, gazing at the street ahead, her face serene, as if content to simply exist in that quiet moment. Her patience was striking, and it forced Richard to re-evaluate not only his plan, but his own assumptions about human nature. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again, her voice soft yet steady. "I don't know what you've been through, sir," she began, her words thoughtful, "but it seems like you've had your share of hard times." She looked at him with that gentle empathy he was beginning to recognize as her hallmark, and Richard felt his carefully constructed walls weakening under her gaze. "Yes," he replied, choosing his words with care. "Life has been challenging in its own way." He felt an odd compulsion to say more, to open up, but he bit back the urge. He was supposed to be observing her, not sharing his own burdens. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I can't pretend to understand what you've gone through," she said, "but I believe that people find strength in the unlikeliest places. Sometimes all it takes is someone to remind you that you're not alone." She paused, her gaze softening as she added, "That's what I think love is, really, showing up for each other, even when things get hard." The simplicity of her words struck Richard more profoundly than he wanted to admit. Here was a young woman who, by all appearances, had faced her share of struggles and yet held onto a belief in the goodness of others. It made him question his own jaded perspective, his assumption that kindness was a rarity, a trait often accompanied by hidden motives. With each moment that passed, Richard's perception of Emily shifted. She was not only kind but resilient, carrying an optimism that he hadn't seen in years. His suspicions about her seemed to fade with every word she spoke, leaving him with a growing respect for her character. And yet, his desire to protect his son remained strong, driving him to continue the test, to push her boundaries just a bit further. Clearing his throat, Richard leaned back, casting her a sidelong glance. "Not everyone holds on to such hope," he said, his tone guarded. "Some people, they only look out for themselves." Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in his words without letting it diminish her own beliefs. "I know that," she replied, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "I've seen people who only care about what they can get, people who forget about others the moment it's inconvenient." Her expression softened, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But I've also seen kindness in places I never expected, from people who had nothing to give except a helping hand." Richard felt a pang of guilt rise within him. Here he was, an affluent man pretending to be someone in need, hoping to test her kindness, while she spoke of compassion with such sincerity. It was unsettling, and he wondered if he was the one failing the test. If, perhaps, his distrust was as much a burden as any hardship he'd experienced. Still, he pressed on, unwilling to let himself be swayed entirely. He knew he needed more than one encounter to erase his doubts. "It must have been hard," he said quietly, "growing up without much." Emily's eyes took on a distant look, her expression tinged with nostalgia. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but it taught me a lot about resilience. My mother always used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they give when they have nothing left." She had such a strong spirit, even when things got tough. Her gaze softened, and Richard could see a flicker of grief hidden beneath her calm exterior. For a brief moment, Richard felt an urge to reveal himself, to tell her who he was and explain why he was there. He wanted to assure her that her kindness hadn't gone unnoticed, that her resilience was seen and valued. But he held back, knowing that doing so would compromise the test. He needed to be certain of her intentions, to ensure that she wasn't simply performing an act of compassion. Yet, the longer he observed her, the harder it was to believe that she was anything other than genuine. She had shown kindness, not only in word, but in deed, and she had done so without knowing who he truly was. Richard found himself torn between his protective instincts and a growing admiration for Emily, feeling as though he was standing on the edge of a precipice. After a while, Emily rose to her feet, brushing the stray leaves from her coat. She glanced down at him, a gentle smile lighting up her face. "If you ever need a place to rest or someone to talk to, you can find me," she said, her tone warm and sincere. "I may not be able to do much, but I'd like to help however I can." Richard nodded, his throat tight with unspoken words. He watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the night, leaving him alone on the bench, wrestling with a flood of emotions he hadn't anticipated. He had expected to confirm his doubts, to find fault in her actions or detect a hint of insincerity. Instead, he was left questioning his own motivations, feeling as though he had been the one placed under scrutiny. As the city lights flickered around him, Richard sat in silence, contemplating the depth of Emily's kindness and the shadows it cast on his own guarded heart. He wondered if his distrust had blinded him to a goodness he was no longer capable of seeing, a warmth he had long since closed himself off from. In the days that followed his first encounter with Emily, Richard felt compelled to deepen his disguise. His initial plan had been to observe her for a single evening, to gauge her kindness and sincerity, but the encounter had left him with more questions than answers. Now, he wanted to see if her compassion was as unwavering as it had seemed. To that end, he committed himself fully to the role, adopting a life that was far removed from his usual comfort and privilege. For the first time in his life, he spent his nights in homeless shelters, sharing space with men and women who had been dealt much harsher cards than he had ever known. The shelters were humble, with rows of worn cots and a few blankets, the air tinged with the scent of damp clothes and the faint residue of cheap coffee. Each night, he lay there in the dark, wrestling with the discomfort of his deception, wondering if he was crossing a moral line in his effort to protect Thomas. During the day, Richard returned to the streets, careful to avoid the upscale areas of London where he might risk being recognized. Instead, he frequented the modest parts of the city, places where Emily would be likely to pass through as part of her daily routine. He observed her quietly, watching how she interacted with the people around her, hoping that these glimpses would reveal something definitive about her character. What surprised him most was the consistency with which she treated others. She was the same with everyone, whether they were strangers or friends, young or old. On one particularly grey afternoon, Richard saw her helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries, her hands deftly arranging bags, while her voice held a gentle patience that never wavered. The woman, hunched and frail, looked at Emily with gratitude, and Richard noticed how Emily brushed it off with a modest smile, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Later that week, he watched from a distance as she approached a young busker playing guitar near a crowded cafe. The musician was rough around the edges, his clothes worn, his guitar scuffed from years of use. Emily paused to listen, a genuine smile brightening her face as the music filled the space between them. When he finished his song, she clapped softly, reaching into her bag for a few coins. Richard observed the scene with a growing sense of discomfort, unable to reconcile his suspicions with the woman he saw before him. Each small act of kindness added weight to the doubt forming within him. Emily's warmth seemed inexhaustible, and it wore at Richard's resolve. He found himself questioning the very motives that had driven him to this deception. Was it truly about protecting Thomas? Or was it his own fear of vulnerability that had led him down this path? These thoughts unsettled him, forcing him to confront aspects of himself he had long ignored, but he wasn't ready to abandon the test yet. Driven by a lingering wariness, he continued his vigil, determined to find some indication of ulterior motives. Each day, however, only seemed to confirm the opposite. Richard watched as she volunteered at a community center, her hands busy sorting donations, her face focused and attentive. He noticed how the other volunteers spoke to her with respect and familiarity, exchanging stories and laughter, sharing a camaraderie that was palpable. As the days passed, Richard began to feel the weight of his deception, the way it gnawed at him each time he saw her. His presence in her life, even from the periphery, felt invasive. It was as though he had inserted himself into her world without permission, becoming a silent witness to her genuine kindness. Yet he continued, bound by the nagging feeling that he owed it to Thomas to be absolutely certain of her intentions. One evening, Richard followed her as she left the community center, her steps light and purposeful as she made her way down the street. She carried a small box, a donation she had collected for a local family in need. Richard trailed her at a safe distance, careful not to be noticed, watching as she stopped to chat with a few people along the way. She seemed to know everyone, exchanging friendly greetings and warm smiles. At one point, she paused to help a man struggling with a large stack of boxes outside a shop. Without hesitation, she set down her own box and reached for one of his, her expression open and willing. Richard felt an uneasy admiration rise within him, conflicting with the growing sense of guilt that weighed on his conscience. He was beginning to question not only her motives, but his own. Was he testing her out of genuine concern, or was it his own inability to trust that was driving him? As he returned to the shelter that night, Richard found himself contemplating the costs of his deception. The cold, hard bench he shared with others felt heavier, as though the burden of his scheme was pressing down on him. He wondered if he was not only testing Emily but himself, measuring his own capacity for trust and forgiveness. Each night spent among strangers, each day observing Emily, was beginning to strip away the defenses he had built over the years. By the end of the week, Richard was forced to admit that Emily's actions had challenged every preconceived notion he had harbored about her. She was genuine, consistent, unwavering in her kindness. Yet, even as he grappled with these revelations, a stubborn part of him held fast to his doubts, unable to let go completely. His experience with betrayal, with people who had once seemed trustworthy, lingered in the back of his mind, a cautionary tale that he couldn't ignore. The realization that he was no closer to confirming his fears than when he had begun left him feeling strangely hollow. Richard's resolve to protect Thomas had been his guiding force, yet it now felt like a flimsy justification for a plan that had unraveled his own perceptions. He returned to his quiet corner of the shelter, his thoughts a tangle of uncertainty, wondering if he had gone too far, if he had let his past cloud his ability to see the good in others. In that dim, crowded room, surrounded by strangers who sought nothing from him, Richard finally allowed himself to consider the possibility that he had been wrong all along. By now, Richard had fully integrated himself into Emily's world, maintaining his disguise as a nameless figure on the margins of her life. Each day, he watched her from a distance, marveling at her consistency, her unwavering kindness. She seemed to embody everything he had hoped to see in his son's future partner, yet the seed of doubt remained, stubborn and unyielding. To deepen his understanding of her character, he allowed himself to draw closer, even engaging indirectly with the people she held dear. It was a cold, misty morning when he observed Emily at a local cafe with a small group of friends. He took a seat near the window, keeping his back turned and his face partially hidden by a frayed cap. He sipped his coffee slowly, listening to the chatter around him, careful to appear as just another stranger passing time in the warmth of the cafe. Emily's friends, a diverse and warm-hearted group, greeted her with easy familiarity. They shared stories, laughter flowing freely between them, a natural harmony that hinted at a shared history. From their conversations, Richard gleaned insights into the woman he'd come to observe so closely. Her friends spoke of her generosity, her willingness to step up when others needed help, her ability to lighten even the heaviest of situations with her gentle humor. One of her friends, a young woman with a kind smile and expressive hands, leaned in and spoke in a conspiratorial tone. "Emily, I swear, if you keep helping out at that center, they're going to start thinking you live there." The table erupted in laughter, Emily joining in, her eyes sparkling with genuine delight. Emily shrugged, a modest blush coloring her cheeks. "I just like being useful," she said, her voice humble. "They need the help, and honestly, I enjoy it." "It reminds me of what matters." Richard watched her, noting the way she deflected praise, shifting the attention away from herself. It was a quality he found oddly admirable, a far cry from the people he usually encountered in his own circles. Her modesty, her grounded nature, they were traits he rarely saw, especially among those who were acquainted with wealth and privilege. Yet here she was, unaffected by the materialism that often accompanied social status, embodying values he had long since forgotten. As the conversation continued, her friends began sharing stories about Emily's small acts of kindness. A man across from her, with a rugged charm and a gentle laugh, recounted how Emily had once spent her entire Saturday helping him paint his new apartment, refusing any form of payment. "She even brought lunch," he said, grinning. "Didn't let me lift a finger in the kitchen." Emily laughed, brushing off his gratitude. "It was just a sandwich," she replied, though her friends clearly knew it was more than that. They teased her about her tendency to go out of her way for others, to put their needs above her own, but their fondness for her was unmistakable. It was a loyalty earned through years of friendship, a testament to the genuine warmth she brought to their lives. Richard felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort as he listened to these stories. On one hand, he was relieved, even heartened, by the accounts of her kindness, by the proof that her compassion extended beyond mere appearances. On the other hand, he felt the weight of his own deception, a growing unease that he could no longer ignore. He was beginning to realize that this test was not only a measure of her character, but a challenge to his own capacity for trust. As he sat there, lost in thought, one of Emily's friends glanced in his direction, eyes narrowing as though recognizing him. Richard stiffened, adjusting his cap, doing his best to appear inconspicuous. The last thing he needed was to draw attention to himself, to arouse suspicion. Fortunately, the friend seemed to lose interest quickly, turning back to the conversation, but the close call left Richard on edge. The following day, he saw Emily again, this time volunteering at a local shelter. Her friends had spoken fondly of her commitment to service, but seeing it firsthand deepened his respect for her. She moved through the shelter with ease, greeting familiar faces, offering her help where it was needed. Richard watched from a distance, noting how the people there responded to her, their expressions softening as she listened to their stories, as she offered small comforts in the form of a warm smile or a gentle touch. In that moment, he felt a pang of self-doubt, wondering if he had been too quick to judge, too blinded by his own experiences to see her for who she truly was. She was not performing for anyone, not seeking validation or praise. Her actions were quiet, unassuming, a reflection of a deeply rooted kindness that needed no audience. Yet, for all the evidence he had gathered, he couldn't entirely let go of his reservations. He had lived too long in a world where trust was fragile, where motives were seldom pure. The fear of betrayal lingered, a shadow that clouded his judgment, making it difficult to fully accept what he saw before him. That evening, Richard returned to the shelter where he had been staying, his mind heavy with conflicting emotions. As he lay on the cot, surrounded by the quiet murmur of other residents settling in for the night, he reflected on the path that had led him here, to this place of uncertainty. He had set out with a single-minded determination to protect his son, to uncover the truth about Emily. Yet he now found himself questioning not only her character, but his own. The faces of Emily's friends, the stories they had shared, lingered in his mind, images that challenged his assumptions and forced him to confront his own insecurities. He felt a strange kinship with the people around him, people who had faced hardship, who had been let down by the world, and in that quiet, dimly lit room, he wondered if he was more like them than he cared to admit. A man searching for answers, for a reason to believe in something greater than himself. As he drifted into a restless sleep, Richard couldn't shake the thought that this journey had become more than he had bargained for, a test not only of Emily's sincerity, but of his own ability to let go of the past. He was beginning to see that trust, like kindness, required a leap of faith, a willingness to believe even when doubt lingered. And as he lay there, his heart heavy with unspoken questions, he realized that this journey was far from over. The days Richard spent shadowing Emily had turned into an unexpected journey, one that left him increasingly uneasy and conflicted. He had set out with a plan, simple in its intentions, but far from straightforward in its execution. What began as a test had become a mirror reflecting back on his own life, his fears and his inability to trust fully. He couldn't escape the feeling that this test was as much about his own unresolved wounds as it was about his son's future. One evening, as he wandered the streets after another day of observing Emily, he found himself walking toward an old church. It wasn't a place he'd been to before, but its open doors and warm light spilling onto the cold street beckoned him inside. Richard stepped in, welcomed by the quiet, a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. He sat down in one of the back pews, letting the stillness settle over him. He stared up at the stained glass windows, their vibrant colors muted in the dim evening light. The depiction of saints and angels, figures of grace and mercy, brought him a strange comfort. Though he couldn't quite explain why, it was here, in this quiet refuge, that his thoughts drifted back to his late wife, Margaret. She had been the one who believed in people, the one who tempered his cynical outlook with her boundless compassion. Margaret would have adored Emily. The realization hit him with unexpected force, a painful reminder of how much he missed his wife's wisdom. She would have seen past his doubts, would have told him to trust his son's heart, but Margaret was gone, and he was left with the heavy responsibility of protecting Thomas on his own. Or at least, that's what he had convinced himself he was doing. The truth he was beginning to confront was that his skepticism was not born solely out of a desire to protect his son, but also from his own inability to let go of past betrayals. Richard had built walls around his heart, fortresses of doubt, to protect himself from disappointment. But here, in this quiet church, he felt those walls beginning to crack. He was tired, weary of the fear that had governed his decisions for so long. He left the church with a sense of vulnerability that unsettled him. The crisp night air bit at his skin as he pulled his coat tighter around him, making his way back to the shelter. His disguise had become second nature now, a part of his daily routine. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a lie, not just for Emily's sake, but for his own. The following day, as he took up his familiar post near Emily's apartment, he felt an unusual heaviness in his chest. It was no longer just a question of her sincerity, it had become a question of his own capacity to believe. He watched as she emerged from her building, greeting the doorman with a warm smile, her steps light as she made her way down the street. There was a gentleness to her, a quiet dignity that he had come to admire, and he felt his resolve falter. As he followed her at a safe distance, he felt a deep-seated frustration rising within him. He was no closer to confirming his suspicions than he had been at the start, yet he couldn't bring himself to let go entirely. His own fear of being deceived, of watching his son suffer, clouded his judgment, creating a tension that weighed on him with every passing day. That evening, after a long day of quiet observation, he found himself alone on a bench, staring at the city lights as they flickered in the distance. The shelter felt stifling that night, and he had left early, unable to shake the thoughts that haunted him. He had come here to uncover the truth about Emily, yet he felt as though he were the one under scrutiny, as if his own heart were being tested. The image of his son surfaced in his mind, Thomas, with his open smile and unguarded optimism. Richard had always marveled at his son's resilience, his ability to trust and connect with others in ways Richard had never managed. He had raised Thomas to be independent, to think for himself, yet he found himself doubting his son's choice, doubting that Thomas could see what Richard saw so clearly. But did he really see clearly? The question gnawed at him, a persistent voice challenging the assumptions he had held so tightly. He realized that his judgment of Emily was not just about protecting Thomas, but about preserving his own sense of control. It was as though he couldn't bear the thought of someone else being right, of someone else seeing the good in others when he could not. Sitting there in the cold, Richard found himself at a breaking point. He could no longer deny the impact Emily had made on him. Her kindness, her integrity had chipped away at his cynicism, forcing him to confront his own insecurities. He wondered if he was pushing her away, not out of genuine concern, but out of his own inability to believe that someone could be so genuinely good. He felt a pang of regret as he thought of Thomas, of the rift that would surely grow between them if Thomas ever discovered the lengths Richard had gone to test Emily's character. He was beginning to see that this deception could cost him more than he had bargained for, not just in terms of his relationship with Emily, but also with his son. As the night grew colder, Richard rose from the bench, his heart heavy with the weight of his own doubts. He knew he couldn't continue like this, hiding behind a mask, testing the patience of a woman who had shown nothing but kindness. But he was afraid of what he might discover about himself if he let go of his fears, afraid that he might be wrong. The city lights blurred as he walked back to the shelter, his mind consumed with questions that had no easy answers. He was beginning to realize that this journey was about more than protecting his son. It was about facing his own demons, about finding the courage to believe in the goodness he saw in Emily. But he didn't know if he was ready to let go of his fear, to step out from behind the walls he had built. As he lay down in the shelter that night, surrounded by the quiet murmur of strangers, Richard felt a strange peace settle over him. He had come here to uncover the truth about Emily, yet he had found himself caught in a struggle with his own heart. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, he wondered if he was finally ready to confront the man he had become. Richard rose early the next morning, feeling a sense of purpose tempered by a deep uncertainty. He was reaching the end of his patience, yet every moment spent in disguise had only further complicated his perception of Emily. The weight of his doubts was now accompanied by a surprising urge to understand her fully, perhaps even to confront her, not as a means of accusation, but as a plea for clarity. The test was drawing to a close, and he needed an answer, not just for Thomas's sake, but for his own. As he made his way to the usual corner where he knew Emily often walked, he rehearsed in his mind how he might approach her, what questions he could ask to reveal her true feelings for Thomas. His plan was shaky at best. He wasn't even certain she would stop to talk with him again. Yet he pressed on, driven by a need he could scarcely admit even to himself, the desire to believe in her, to find proof that his doubts were baseless. Finally, he saw her. She was walking along the street, her pace unhurried, a slight smile on her face as she greeted the familiar faces of the neighborhood. Richard observed her for a moment, his chest tightening as he prepared to intercept her. When she drew near, he gathered his courage and called out, "Miss, do you have a moment?" Emily stopped, surprise flashing in her eyes as she recognized him. For an instant, he feared she might walk past, dismissing him as another stranger. But then she softened, her face opening into a gentle smile. "Of course," she said, stepping closer. "Is everything all right?" Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to thank you for your kindness the other night," he began, his voice low and measured. "Not everyone would have taken the time. Most people walk by, you know." Emily looked at him with quiet understanding. "I'm just glad I could help," she replied, her tone warm but unassuming. She held his gaze, waiting for him to continue. He took a steadying breath, sensing that this moment was pivotal. "It's rare finding someone who treats others with such genuine compassion," he said, his words carrying a weight he hadn't intended to reveal. "My son, well, he always speaks highly of people like you. I sometimes wonder if there are more people out there like him, people who see the world with that same openness." Emily's expression softened at the mention of his son, though she was clearly unaware of his true identity. "He sounds like a wonderful person," she said. "And it's true. I believe there are many people who want to help, who want to make a difference. Sometimes you just have to look a little harder to find them." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Richard felt an unbidden sense of relief. He couldn't help but be struck by her response, her words touching on something he had forgotten long ago. "Do you think do you think it's enough?" he asked, his voice betraying a vulnerability he hadn't meant to reveal. Emily's eyes held his, and she seemed to consider his question carefully. "I think it's a start," she said softly. "Kindness doesn't fix everything, but it opens the door for understanding. And that's what we all need, isn't it? A little more understanding." Richard found himself nodding, a sense of respect blooming within him. He had doubted her intentions, her sincerity, but here she was, speaking with a conviction that touched something deep within him. He realized that she wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all a man she believed to be a stranger on the streets. Her kindness was real, unprompted, and that realization both comforted and challenged him. The moment was interrupted as she shifted, glancing at her watch with a slight frown. "I should get going," she said, though her voice held a trace of reluctance. "But it was nice talking with you again. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out." Richard hesitated, then asked the question that had been gnawing at him for days. "Forgive me, but do you truly care for people, regardless of what they can give you? Even if they have nothing?" Emily looked at him, a glint of surprise in her eyes, but her answer was immediate. "Yes, I do," she replied, her tone unwavering. "Everyone has something to give, even if it's just a smile or a listening ear, and sometimes that's worth more than anything money can buy." Her response left him speechless, and as she walked away, Richard felt a wave of clarity wash over him. The doubts he had harbored, the fears that had driven him to concoct this plan, all seemed trivial in the face of her quiet conviction. He realized that he had been searching for proof that she was flawed, that her kindness was a facade, but instead he had found something he had long since lost faith in, the strength of a good heart. For the first time, he allowed himself to see Emily as Thomas did, as someone who brought light into a world too often overshadowed by cynicism. And in that moment, he understood that this journey had been about more than protecting his son. It had been about finding redemption for himself, about learning to believe again. As he stood there, watching her disappear into the crowd, he felt an overwhelming urge to share this revelation with Thomas, to confess his doubts and seek forgiveness for the deception that had driven them apart. But he knew he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. First, he needed to come to terms with his own mistakes, to find a way to let go of the bitterness that had kept him isolated for so long. Richard turned, his steps unsteady, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had come here to expose Emily's character, yet he had found himself exposed instead, his fears laid bare before the kindness he had tried so hard to test. And as he walked back to the shelter that night, he felt a quiet determination take root within him, a resolve to mend not only his relationship with Thomas, but also the parts of himself he had neglected for far too long. Just as Richard was beginning to think he might be ready to reveal his identity to Emily, an unexpected complication threw his plans into disarray. On a chilly evening, as he lingered near Emily's apartment building to watch her return from work, a figure approached him. A man with the sturdy, weather-worn look of someone who worked with his hands for a living. The man squinted at Richard, his expression hardening as he took in Richard's disheveled appearance, his worn coat, and the weary lines on his face. "What are you doing here?" the man demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. He positioned himself directly in front of Richard, blocking his view of Emily's building. Richard took a step back, caught off guard. "Just minding my own business," he replied, his voice low, trying to sound unassuming. The man crossed his arms, his gaze unrelenting. "This is private property," he said firmly. "We don't need folks like you loitering around here. Move along now." Richard felt a flash of irritation, but he reminded himself of his disguise. "I'm not causing any trouble," he muttered, attempting to sound meek. "Just waiting." The man's brow furrowed, his expression turning steely. "Waiting Waiting for what? He shot back. He was clearly not the type to be easily persuaded, and Richard realized that any further argument would only escalate the situation. He considered backing away, finding another vantage point, when the sound of footsteps caught their attention. Emily appeared, holding a few grocery bags, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. She looked between Richard and the man, confusion etched across her face. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, addressing the man beside her. Richard's stomach dropped. So, this was her father. The man, who was now clearly unsettled, looked to Emily. This man here was hanging around, looking suspicious. "Just thought I'd ask what his business is here," he explained. Still glancing warily at Richard, Emily took a step forward, concern flickering in her eyes. "I know him, Dad. He's not a threat," she said softly, placing a hand on her father's arm. Her voice was calm, measured, as though she knew how to diffuse his temper. He's just a friend." Her father's expression softened slightly, though suspicion lingered. "A friend?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. He looked Richard up and down, clearly unimpressed by his appearance. What kind of friend? Richard could feel the scrutiny bearing down on him, and for the first time he felt the sting of his own deception. Here he was, posing as a down-and-out stranger, a friend by Emily's word, and yet he was the one deceiving her. He felt a sharp pang of guilt, but forced himself to maintain his act. "Yes, just a friend," Emily insisted gently, her voice filled with quiet conviction. She looked Richard in the eyes, offering a reassuring nod. "He's been through a hard time and, well, he's just someone who could use a bit of kindness." Her father's shoulders slumped, and he looked at Richard with something closer to pity than suspicion. "Emily," he sighed, "you always see the best in people, but sometimes you've got to be careful. Not everyone deserves that trust." The words stung, and Richard felt the weight of his actions bear down on him. Here was Emily, defending him to her father, vouching for his character without hesitation, and yet she had no idea who he truly was. The irony twisted painfully in his chest, a reminder of how far he had gone to test her sincerity. Emily's father gave Richard one last look, then turned back to his daughter. Just be careful, all right?" he said, a note of worry in his voice. Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "I know, Dad, but trust me on this." Her father grunted, casting Richard a final wary glance before turning and heading toward the building, leaving Emily alone with him. She watched her father disappear into the entrance before turning back to Richard, a soft smile on her face. "I'm sorry about that," she said, her tone apologetic. "My dad can be a little protective." Richard managed a small nod, trying to mask the tumult of emotions churning inside him. "No need to apologize," he replied quietly. "He's just looking out for you." Emily seemed relieved, her smile growing as she relaxed. "Thank you for understanding. It's just that, well, he's always been cautious about the people I bring into my life. He means well, even if he can be intense." She laughed softly, a sound that eased the tension between them. Richard took a deep breath, the guilt gnawing at him, wondering how much longer he could keep up this pretense. He felt the urge to tell her everything, to come clean, but the words remained lodged in his throat. He wasn't ready, not yet. There were still things he needed to know, things he needed to understand, before he could risk losing her trust completely. Instead, he chose his words carefully, his voice soft. "Emily, you're a remarkable person. Not everyone would stand up for someone like me, especially when it means going against their own family's concerns." Emily looked at him, her eyes reflecting a gentle warmth. "I've learned that sometimes you have to listen to your own instincts, even when others don't agree. My dad, he's had his fair share of bad experiences, and I get where he's coming from. But I believe in giving people a chance. Everyone deserves a bit of trust, a little faith." Her words hit him harder than she could have imagined. Richard felt a rush of emotion well up within him, a combination of admiration and shame. He had spent weeks questioning her, doubting her character, and here she was, standing before him, embodying a faith in others that he had almost forgotten existed. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You take care of yourself, all right?" she said, her tone gentle. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." With that, she turned and made her way toward the building, leaving Richard alone on the sidewalk. He watched her disappear inside, her figure fading into the glow of the apartment's entryway, and he felt a heaviness settle over him. The confrontation with her father had been unexpected, a stark reminder of the consequences that could unfold if his deception were discovered. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had also deepened his understanding of her. He turned away, the cold night air biting at his face as he began to walk. The words of Emily's father echoed in his mind, a cautionary reminder that resonated with the doubts he'd harbored for so long. Yet Emily's unwavering trust, her willingness to defend him even when faced with her father's skepticism, had left an indelible mark on him. As he made his way back to the shelter, Richard wrestled with a growing realization. Emily's compassion was not just a passing virtue, it was the foundation of her character, something that guided her actions even in the face of opposition. And though his deception weighed heavily on him, he began to see that this journey was more than a test of her sincerity. It was a test of his own ability to trust, to believe that perhaps, after all he had seen and endured, there was still goodness worth protecting. In the days following the tense encounter with Emily's father, Richard couldn't shake the weight of their confrontation. The older man's words echoed in his mind, a harsh reminder of the boundaries he was beginning to cross. He'd posed as someone in need, testing not just Emily's character, but her family's trust as well. Yet, as he reflected on Emily's unwavering support, even in the face of her father's skepticism, Richard found himself torn between guilt and admiration. Then, something unexpected happened. On a quiet afternoon, as he lingered near the local cafe where he often saw Emily, he spotted her father again. The man hadn't noticed him, but he seemed lost in thought. His shoulders slouched as he sipped a coffee by the window. Richard hesitated, unsure whether to approach. He knew the risk, but he also sensed that this might be an opportunity to confront the doubts that had gnawed at him since their last encounter. Summoning his courage, Richard entered the cafe, careful to maintain his disguise. He took a seat nearby, close enough to catch the man's attention without intruding. After a moment, Emily's father glanced up, his gaze settling on Richard with faint recognition. His brows knitted together, and he leaned forward, his tone cautious but not unkind. "You're that friend of my daughter's," he said, his voice measured, carrying the quiet authority of a man who didn't easily trust. Richard nodded, unsure of how much to reveal. "Yes, we've met," he replied, choosing his words with care. "I appreciate what she did, standing up for me. Not many people would." Emily's father studied him for a moment, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Emily's always had a soft spot for helping others," he said, his tone laced with a mixture of pride and caution. "Sometimes, I wonder if she's a bit too trusting for her own good." Richard felt a pang of guilt, but held his gaze steady. "You don't think much of people in my position, do you?" he asked quietly, a genuine question rather than an accusation. The man sighed, glancing down at his coffee. "It's not about that. I've just seen too many people take advantage of kindness. Emily doesn't understand what it's like to be let down by those you trust." His voice softened, tinged with a weariness that resonated with Richard. There was something deeply familiar in the man's guarded expression, a look Richard had seen in the mirror countless times. For a moment, they sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Richard felt the urge to tell him the truth, to explain why he was there and what had driven him to test his own family's boundaries. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself responding in a way that surprised even him. "I know what it's like to be let down," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes you put your faith in someone, only to find out that they saw you as nothing more than a means to an end." He paused, feeling a strange sense of vulnerability as he spoke, almost as if he were confessing to himself as much as to Emily's father. The older man nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "I've been there too," he replied, his tone heavy with unspoken memories. "Lost my job once because of it. Trusted the wrong people." He shook his head, a small, bitter smile crossing his lips. "But Emily, she doesn't see the world that way. She believes in people, no matter what." Richard listened, a mixture of admiration and envy swirling within him. Emily's father spoke of her optimism with a reverence that Richard found himself beginning to share. The man's words revealed a deep respect for his daughter, a recognition of her character that transcended his own cynicism. After a long pause, Emily's father looked Richard squarely in the eyes, his gaze piercing but not hostile. "Look, I don't know who you are or what your story is," he began, his tone steady. "But if you're close to my daughter, I need to know one thing. Are you taking advantage of her kindness?" The question hit Richard harder than he had expected, the weight of his deception pressing down on him. For a moment, he considered telling the truth, revealing his real identity and the purpose of his actions. But he wasn't ready for that yet. Not here, not under these circumstances. Instead, he chose to answer in the only way he could without fully betraying his intentions. "No," he replied, his voice low but resolute. "I would never want to hurt her." The man studied him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Good, because if you do, you'll have to answer to me." Richard managed a small smile, feeling a strange mixture of relief and respect. "Understood," he replied, a hint of gratitude in his tone. He felt a kinship with Emily's father, an unspoken connection born from shared experiences of betrayal and loss. For the first time, he found himself beginning to understand the older man's protectiveness, recognizing it as an echo of his own fears for Thomas. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, each man lost in his own reflections. Richard could feel the walls he'd constructed around himself beginning to shift, a subtle but unmistakable change. He realized that this conversation had opened a door, a small crack in his resolve that allowed him to see things from a different perspective. Before he left, Emily's father extended his hand, a gesture that surprised Richard. He accepted it, feeling the firm grip of a man who, despite his suspicions, had chosen to offer a tentative acceptance. It was a small gesture, but it held a significance that resonated deeply with Richard. As he walked away from the cafe, Richard felt a newfound clarity settling over him. This encounter had forced him to confront his own insecurities, to recognize that his fears were not unique, but part of a shared human experience. The walls he had built, the doubts he had harbored, were not solely his burden to bear. They were shared by those who had loved and lost, by those who, like Emily's father, struggled to protect the ones they cared about. Richard returned to the shelter that evening with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His journey was far from over, but he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, through this experience, he could learn to let go of the mistrust that had ruled his life. As the days drifted on, Richard sensed a growing urgency. He had ventured into this elaborate disguise, hoping to reveal Emily's true nature, but now he was the one faced with uncomfortable truths about himself. He had come to terms with his own mistrust, recognizing it as a flaw shaped by years of guarded relationships and calculated choices. Yet, even as his defenses crumbled, he still couldn't bring himself to reveal his identity. His deception, as well-intentioned as he had thought it to be, now felt like a betrayal to both Emily and his son, Thomas. But time was no longer on his side. One morning, as he quietly watched Emily from a distance, he received a shock that jolted him back to reality. Thomas was there, waiting on the steps of Emily's apartment with a small velvet box clutched tightly in his hand. Richard's heart raced as he recognized the box, a family heirloom, the ring that had belonged to his own mother, a symbol he had cherished and passed on to Thomas with the quiet hope that it would one day find its way to someone truly deserving. Thomas's presence meant only one thing. He was preparing to propose. The realization struck Richard like a lightning bolt. His son, the man he had so fiercely tried to protect, had taken a leap of faith that Richard himself was still too fearful to embrace. Watching him, standing there with a mixture of nervous anticipation, Richard felt an unexpected pang of pride mingled with dread. As Emily emerged from the building, her face lighting up when she spotted Thomas, Richard couldn't look away. He felt as though he were intruding on a moment that wasn't his to witness. Yet he couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze from the scene unfolding before him. Thomas took a deep breath, his face filled with determination, and walked toward her. Richard's mind raced as he grappled with what to do, his own deception and doubts now feeling like a heavy weight he couldn't ignore. When they embraced, he saw Thomas's face soften as he whispered something to Emily, his hand slipping protectively around her waist. In that moment, Richard felt an overwhelming need to intervene, to confess everything, to explain the tangled web he had woven in the name of protection. But he was paralyzed by the fear of the consequences, of the pain that might fracture the relationship he held so dear. Still hidden in the shadows, he watched as Thomas reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the velvet box. The anticipation in Emily's eyes was palpable, her gaze never leaving his face as he took her hand in his. Richard held his breath, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely afraid. Thomas took a deep breath, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "Emily," he began, his tone soft but resolute. "These past few years with you, I can't imagine my life without you by my side. You've brought light and love into everything, and I want nothing more than to spend my life with you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her hand covering her mouth as Thomas knelt, holding out the box and revealing the heirloom ring. Her astonished smile was bright, radiant with a happiness that left Richard both comforted and tormented. Here was his son, willing to make the ultimate commitment, placing his trust and heart in her hands without hesitation. The stark contrast to his own guarded nature left Richard feeling vulnerable and exposed, a man at odds with his own convictions. But as he watched Thomas, a thought struck him with undeniable clarity. His son didn't need his protection anymore. Thomas had made his choice, a choice based not on money or status, but on love, on the purity of a connection that Richard himself had doubted and dissected. His son, who had grown up with every privilege, had somehow remained untouched by the cynicism that had clouded Richard's own perspective. Emily threw her arms around Thomas, her answer muffled but unmistakable as she nodded through her tears, clutching him as though she never wanted to let go. Richard felt his heart twist, the joy on his son's face a stark reminder of the lengths he had gone to, of the mistrust he had harbored. He had seen her kindness, her consistency, her unwavering compassion, and yet it had taken watching his son's happiness to finally force him to confront the truth he had been unwilling to accept. As the reality of Thomas's proposal settled in, Richard took a step back, the gravity of his actions settling over him like a storm cloud. If he continued this path, if he allowed his deception to linger, he risked destroying everything he had tried so desperately to preserve. His son's faith in him, the bond they had shared, all of it hung by a fragile thread, one that would snap the moment his lies came to light. And so, with a heavy heart, he turned and walked away from the scene, leaving Thomas and Emily in their newfound joy. The cold air stung his face as he moved through the streets, his mind consumed with regret and a growing sense of resolve. He knew that he couldn't continue down this road, not if he valued the trust and love his son had shown him all these years. For the rest of the day, Richard wandered the city in a daze, his thoughts tangled in a web of remorse and hope. He had one last chance to make things right, to show his son that he trusted him, that he believed in his ability to choose wisely. The weight of his own failings pressed down on him, but he clung to the hope that it wasn't too late to undo the damage he had wrought. As dusk settled over the city, Richard made his way back to his quiet corner of the shelter, feeling both the burden of his mistakes and a newfound clarity. He would come clean, lay bare the fears and doubts that had driven him, and accept whatever consequences awaited him. It was the only way forward, the only way to truly honor the love his son had found. After the whirlwind of emotions stirred by witnessing his son's proposal, Richard knew he was running out of time. He couldn't delay much longer. The need to confess the truth pressed on him with a weight he could no longer ignore. Yet, his resolve was soon tested when an unexpected figure confronted him the following evening. As Richard sat on a bench near Emily's apartment, grappling with the steps he would need to take, he sensed someone approaching. Looking up, he saw a young woman he recognized from the cafe, Emily's best friend, Olivia. She was a spirited person, sharp-eyed and intuitive, the type who could spot insincerity from a mile away. She had observed him from a distance before, her eyes narrowing whenever their paths crossed. But tonight, she looked determined. "Excuse me," Olivia said, crossing her arms and giving him a hard, appraising look. "I've seen you around here a lot lately, watching Emily and Thomas. You're not just a passerby, are you?" Caught off guard, Richard forced himself to remain calm. "I'm just an acquaintance," he replied, keeping his voice even. "Someone who admires them from afar." Olivia's skeptical gaze didn't falter. She took a step closer, her tone firm. "That's interesting, because Emily's told me about the man she's been helping, the one she defended to her dad, but something about this doesn't sit right with me. You show up around her place, around her family, and no one knows who you really are. So, who are you, really?" The intensity in her voice left no room for deflection. Richard knew he could either try to sidestep her questions or come clean, at least in part. He took a deep breath, realizing he owed her, if not the entire truth, then an explanation that would ease her concerns. "My name's Richard," he began slowly, weighing each word. "I'm connected to Thomas, in a way I'm not ready to explain just yet." He saw her expression harden, her suspicion sharpening at his evasiveness. "But I swear, I mean no harm to them. I just needed to understand if Emily was who she seemed to be." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "So Chip, you're here testing her? You're, some sort of judge on her character? Emily deserves better than this, better than someone lurking around, questioning her sincerity." Richard felt the sting of her words, each one cutting through the thin veneer of his defenses. He knew she was right. He had crossed a line. "It may seem cruel," he admitted, his voice softening, "but I did it out of love for my son. I needed to be sure she was the right person for him." "Then you don't trust him at all, do you?" Olivia's tone held a quiet fury. "Because if you did, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be playing this game behind their backs." The truth in her statement hit him like a blow. She was right. His actions showed a lack of faith not just in Emily, but in Thomas's ability to choose wisely. to follow his own heart without interference. His protective instincts had morphed into something darker, an attempt to control, to validate his own fears rather than to trust his son. Olivia continued, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. You don't know her, Richard. Emily's the best person I know. She's kind, honest, and she cares about Thomas more than anything. The fact that you've been testing her, it's not fair. She deserves better, and so does Thomas. Richard looked down, his chest tightening as guilt washed over him. He wanted to argue, to explain himself more fully, but he knew there was little he could say to justify his actions. He had allowed his own insecurities to cloud his judgment, to lead him down a path he now regretted. Standing here, confronted by the unwavering loyalty of Emily's friend, he felt the full weight of his misjudgment. Olivia shook her head, her disappointment clear. I don't know who you are, Richard, or why you think this was necessary. But if you care about Thomas, truly care about him, you'll come clean. You'll give Emily the chance to show you who she is without hiding behind this disguise. She turned to leave, casting one last look over her shoulder. Remember, trust goes both ways. If you want her to prove herself, then maybe it's time you prove yourself too. As Olivia disappeared into the evening, her words echoed in Richard's mind, reverberating like the tolling of a bell. For days, he had rationalized his actions, telling himself he was acting in his son's best interest. But now, stripped of his justifications, he could see the selfishness at the heart of his plan. He had been so blinded by his own fears that he had lost sight of the very values he'd hoped to protect in his family. Feeling a mix of remorse and determination, Richard knew what he had to do. He needed to confront Emily, not as a stranger, but as the man he truly was. He owed her and his son the truth. More importantly, he owed them his trust, his willingness to believe in the goodness he had seen so clearly in her actions. The following morning, he made his way back to the cafe, his heart heavy but resolute. He would find Emily, explain himself, and accept whatever consequences came. The prospect of revealing his identity filled him with a sense of vulnerability he hadn't felt in years, but he knew he could no longer hide behind his disguise. As he walked through the streets, the weight of his decision settled over him, each step carrying the significance of what was to come. This confrontation was inevitable, and though he feared the outcome, he also felt a strange sense of liberation, as though a burden he had carried for years was finally lifting. When he reached the cafe, he scanned the tables, hoping to see her familiar figure among the mourning crowd. His heart pounded, a nervous anticipation building within him. Today, he would lay everything bare, not as a test, but as a surrender, a relinquishing of the control he had so fiercely clung to. And as he waited, his gaze fixed on the doorway, he found himself preparing not just for a confession, but for a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild the trust he had nearly destroyed. Determined to make things right, Richard sat in the cafe, his heart racing as he thought of what lay ahead. He had been waiting for over an hour, his eyes glued to the entrance, hoping Emily would appear. The weight of his deception bore down on him, and he knew that he could no longer hide behind his disguise. Today, he would reveal himself, strip away the pretense, and lay bare the reasons that had led him to test her so harshly. As he sipped his coffee, his mind raced through the words he wanted to say. How could he explain that his doubts weren't rooted in her actions, but in his own unresolved fears? How could he make her understand that his mistrust had stemmed from years of seeing the worst in people, of watching relationships dissolve under the strain of selfish motives? Just as he was losing himself in thought, he looked up and saw Emily enter the cafe. She wore a simple coat, her hair loosely tied back, and her eyes held a brightness that seemed to light up the room. Richard's heart tightened, a surge of guilt and admiration swelling within him. Here was the woman who had shown him kindness without ever knowing who he was, who had defended him even when her own family expressed doubt, and now he was about to shatter the trust she had placed in him. He waited until she ordered her coffee and found a seat by the window, the light streaming in and casting a soft glow over her face. Taking a deep breath, Richard rose from his seat and approached her table, each step laden with the gravity of what he was about to do. "Emily," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to recognition and then to a faint confusion. "Richard," she asked, her brow furrowing slightly, "is everything okay?" He managed a small nod, though he could feel his nerves fraying. "Could we talk?" he asked, gesturing to the seat across from her. I have something important to tell you." Emily's eyes softened, and she motioned for him to sit, concern evident on her face. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Richard settled into the chair, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. He took a moment to compose himself, gathering his thoughts, knowing that what he was about to say would likely change everything. "Emily," he began, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and determination, "there's something you don't know about me, something I should have told you from the start." Her expression grew more serious, though she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "The truth is, I'm not who you think I am," he said, his voice wavering. "I'm not just some stranger you met on the street. I'm Richard Alton, Thomas's father." A flicker of shock crossed her face, her eyes widening as she processed his words. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her gaze locked on him in a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "I know this must seem strange," he continued, his tone pleading, "but I didn't come to you as myself because I needed to understand who you were, without the influence of my name or my wealth. I wanted to be certain that you were the right person for my son." Emily's expression shifted from shock to hurt, and she looked down, her hands clasped tightly together. Richard felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest as he watched her struggle to process the revelation. "So, all this time," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "you were testing me?" He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't mean to deceive you, Emily. I thought I was protecting Thomas. I've seen people betray trust, use kindness for their own gain, and I didn't want that for him. But I realize now that I've hurt you, and I can't express how sorry I am." Emily remained silent, her gaze fixed on the table as she absorbed his words. The vulnerability in her expression cut through him, a painful reminder of the damage his mistrust had caused. After a long moment, she looked up, her eyes filled with a quiet resilience that surprised him. "I understand why you did it," she said slowly, her voice trembling but steady, "but it doesn't make it right. You watched me, judged me, without ever giving me the chance to be honest with you. Do you know how that feels? To know that someone you trusted was hiding their true intentions?" Richard swallowed, his throat tight with regret. "I'm sorry, Emily. I can't undo what I've done, but I hope that you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Thomas loves you, and I know now that he made the right choice. You are exactly the kind of person I hoped he would find." Emily's gaze softened, though the hurt remained in her eyes. "Richard, I appreciate that you've come to see that, but trust is a two-way street. You didn't trust me enough to be honest, and that breaks something. I'm not sure I can just forgive and forget." Richard's heart sank, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloud. He had expected anger, maybe even a confrontation, but her calm, steady response cut deeper than he could have anticipated. She was right. He had broken a bond that might never fully heal, a trust that he had taken for granted in his pursuit of certainty. "I understand," he whispered, his voice thick with remorse. "And whatever you decide, I'll respect it. I just wanted you to know the truth." Emily looked at him, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and compassion. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "But I need time, Richard. Time to process this, to understand what it means for me and for Thomas." He nodded, the sting of her words a painful but necessary truth. "Take all the time you need," he replied. "I'll be here, hoping that someday you might be able to forgive me." She offered a small nod, her gaze distant as she gathered her belongings, leaving him alone at the table, her absence a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. As she walked away, Richard felt a hollow ache settle in his chest, a realization that he had not only tested Emily, but had, in the process, tested himself and failed. He remained seated long after she had gone, the cafe emptying around him as the day faded into evening. The days that followed Richard's confession were heavy with silence. He hadn't seen or heard from Emily, and the weight of her parting words hung over him like a shadow. Each morning, he waited by the phone, hoping she might reach out, that perhaps they could begin to bridge the divide his deception had created. But as days turned into weeks, he was forced to confront the painful truth that he had shattered something vital, a bond that might never fully mend. In his heart, he knew that he needed to speak with Thomas as well. He dreaded the conversation, knowing the betrayal his son would feel, but he also knew that continuing to hide would only deepen the wound. Richard gathered his courage, reminding himself that he had come this far to protect his son, and the only way to honor that intention now was through honesty, however painful it might be. One evening, he invited Thomas to meet him at a quiet park where they had once spent time together in Thomas's youth. The place held memories of laughter, of shared dreams, of a time when trust between them had been implicit, unbreakable. As he waited for his son to arrive, Richard felt the gnawing dread that this trust, once so strong, might never be the same after tonight. Thomas arrived, looking both eager and slightly puzzled. "Dad, this is a surprise," he said with a small smile, though his expression quickly shifted to concern as he saw the tension in Richard's face. "Thomas," Richard began, his voice heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you from the beginning." Thomas's brows furrowed, his eyes searching his father's face for a clue to the revelation that was about to unfold. "Dad, what's going on? You're scaring me." Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself. "It's about Emily and me. I haven't been honest with you, son. I tested her, tried to see if she was truly worthy of you. I pretended to be someone I wasn't, watching her, testing her kindness. I was afraid of you being hurt, of seeing you fall into the hands of someone who didn't deserve you." As he spoke, he saw the hurt bloom in Thomas's eyes, a raw wound forming as each word landed with crushing impact. Thomas took a step back, his face pale with shock and betrayal. You tested Emily," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. You put her through some game to see if she was good enough." "For me?" Richard nodded, guilt gnawing at him as he met his son's accusing gaze. "I did," he admitted, his voice breaking, "and I realize now how wrong I was. Emily is. She is everything I could have hoped for and more. But I let my own fears, my own insecurities, cloud my judgment. I wanted to be certain, and in doing so, I betrayed both of you." Thomas's expression shifted from shock to anger, his eyes blazing with a fury Richard had rarely seen. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "You didn't trust me enough to make my own choice. Didn't you believe that I could choose someone who truly cared for me?" Richard felt his heart splinter as he saw the pain in his son's face, a reflection of the trust he had so recklessly discarded. "Thomas, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I want you to know that everything I did, however misguided, was because I love you. I thought I was protecting you, but now I see that I only pushed you further away." Thomas shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment and sorrow. "Dad, I thought you understood me. I thought you trusted me to find my own way, to love who I choose without you watching over my shoulder. I can't believe you would go behind my back, that you'd hurt Emily like this." The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, the air heavy with the unspoken pain that lingered between them. Richard could feel the distance growing, a chasm he feared might never be bridged. He wanted to reach out, to hold his son, to somehow erase the damage he had caused. But he knew that the road to healing, if it even existed, would be long and uncertain. "Thomas," he said softly, his voice thick with regret, "I know I've hurt you and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm here and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I know I can't undo the past, but if there's any way to earn back your trust, I'll find it." Thomas looked away, his jaw clenched as he struggled to contain his emotions. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," he said finally, his tone laced with the bitterness of betrayal. "You didn't just test Emily. You tested me, my ability to choose, my right to love without interference. You treated me like a child, and I don't know if I can just get over that." Richard felt a wave of despair wash over him, the full weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. He had always believed that his love for Thomas was a protective force, a shield against the world's cruelties. But now he saw that his love, twisted by fear, had become a weapon that had inflicted deep wounds on the person he cared for most. As they stood in silence, Richard felt a tear slip down his cheek, the first crack in the armor he had worn for so many years. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Without another word, Thomas turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the dim light of the park. Richard stood alone, his heart shattered, the cold night air biting into his skin as he struggled to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. He had come here to protect his son, but he had ended up losing him in the process. And as the darkness closed in around him, Richard knew that he would have to face the long road ahead alone, hoping that one day, perhaps, he might find a way to mend the broken bonds that lay scattered in his wake. In the days that followed, Richard was left reeling, haunted by the aftermath of his confession to Thomas. The harsh truth of their confrontation lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the pain he had inflicted, not just on his son, but on himself. His relationship with Thomas, once filled with mutual respect and warmth, now felt fragile, as though one more misstep could shatter it entirely. The silence from both his son and Emily was deafening, a reminder that his actions had irrevocably changed the landscape of his family. Each night, he lay awake, replaying the conversation in his mind, searching for the moment when he might have made a different choice, but no amount of regret could undo the damage. Thomas's words filled with betrayal and anger, echoed in Richard's heart, each one piercing the wall of self-righteousness he had so carefully constructed over the years. And then, one evening, he received a message. It was from Thomas, terse and direct, asking him to meet at a small cafe near Emily's apartment. Richard's heart raced as he read the words, a mixture of relief and dread filling him. Perhaps this was a chance to rebuild, to find some path back to the relationship he had lost. But he also knew that whatever Thomas had to say would not come easily, and he would have to be prepared to face the consequences with humility. The following day, Richard arrived at the cafe early, his nerves frayed as he waited. The familiar scent of coffee filled the air, mingling with the low hum of quiet conversations around him. He felt as though he were in a fog, each second stretching painfully as he anticipated his son's arrival. Finally, Thomas walked through the door, his face set in a calm, almost detached expression. He spotted Richard immediately, but there was none of the warmth that had once marked their greetings. Instead, he gave a brief nod and approached the table, sitting across from his father with an air of quiet resolve. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard said, his voice softer than usual. He wanted to reach across the table, to offer some small gesture of reassurance, but he held back, unsure if such familiarity was even welcome. Thomas met his gaze, his expression guarded. "I needed to talk to you," he replied, his tone clipped. "There are things I need to say, and I want you to hear them without interrupting." Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Of course. I'll listen." Thomas took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Dad, I've spent my whole life looking up to you, admiring the way you built everything from nothing, the way you protected us, provided for us. You taught me about integrity, about the importance of trust. But now I feel like I don't know you at all." The weight of his words struck Richard like a physical blow. He wanted to respond, to reassure his son, but he forced himself to remain silent, allowing Thomas the space to speak. "You saw Emily as some kind of test," Thomas continued, his voice wavering slightly. "Someone you needed to judge, to make sure she was good enough for me. But don't you see, I chose her. I chose her because I knew she was the one, and I didn't need anyone's permission to love her. Least of all yours." Richard could feel his heart breaking with each word, the unfiltered honesty in his son's voice, exposing the depth of the hurt he had caused. "Thomas," he said quietly, struggling to keep his composure, "I know I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was only protecting myself from my own fears. I was afraid of losing you, afraid that you would get hurt." Thomas shook his head, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Do you really think you protected me by deceiving me, by hurting the woman I love? Dad, you've caused more pain than any outside force ever could. You took away something precious, the trust I had in you. And I don't know if I can get that back." Richard felt a wave of despair wash over him, the realization settling in that he might have lost the one thing he had valued most, the bond with his son. "Thomas, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make it right. If there's anything I can do, anything at all." For a long moment, Thomas said nothing, his gaze focused on a point somewhere beyond Richard, lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, though his words carried a weight that Richard couldn't ignore. "You can start by apologizing to Emily," Thomas said, his tone resolute, "not just for what you did, but for doubting her, for treating her like some kind of project instead of a person. She deserves that much." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I will," he promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll speak to her and tell her everything, and I'll understand if she never forgives me, but I'll do it for you." Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good. But don't think this makes things right between us, Dad. It's going to take time for me to trust you again, if that's even possible." The finality in Thomas's words was like a knife twisting in Richard's heart. He knew that his actions had left scars, not just on Emily, but on his relationship with his son. And as he looked across the table at the young man he had raised, he felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride for the strength Thomas had shown, and sorrow for the wounds he had inflicted. "I understand," Richard replied, his voice filled with quiet resignation, "and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. Just know that I love you, Thomas. That's never changed. and it never will. Thomas's expression softened slightly, though the distance in his gaze remained. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before rising from his seat. "Take care, Dad," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of finality that left Richard feeling hollow. As Thomas walked away, leaving him alone in the cafe, Richard felt a profound sense of loss, a void that no apology or promise could easily fill. He knew that he had set in motion a chain of events that might never fully resolve, but he also knew that he had taken the first step toward facing his mistakes. He sat there long after his son had gone, his mind heavy with the reality of what lay ahead. The road to redemption was long, filled with uncertainty, but he would walk it willingly, one step at a time, in the hope that one day he might regain the trust he had so thoughtlessly discarded. Days turned into weeks, and Richard felt himself sinking into a loneliness he hadn't anticipated. The emptiness that lingered after his meetings with Thomas and Emily haunted him, filling his life with a quiet desolation that words couldn't soothe. The damage he had wrought was all-consuming, and though he had taken the first steps to make amends, he knew his journey toward redemption had barely begun. Unable to bear the silence of his empty home and the wealth that had brought him no solace, Richard made a drastic decision. He began the process of distancing himself from his riches, liquidating assets, cutting ties with the world that had once defined him. He told his financial advisors to transfer large portions of his wealth into community trusts, programs for youth mentorship, and shelters that offered support to the homeless. The wealth that had once been his fortress of security now felt like a burden, a reminder of the isolation it had imposed upon him and the walls it had built around his heart. But even as he divested himself of his fortune, Richard felt no sense of victory. This was not a grand gesture or an act of absolution. It was simply an attempt to strip away the layers of privilege that had shielded him from reality. He had lived too long in a world of luxury and control, blind to the deeper truths of human connection, and now he needed to step away from it all, to begin again, humbly and without expectations. He found himself volunteering at a small community outreach center, a modest place where people in need could find warmth, food, and a listening ear. The work was simple, unglamorous, yet it brought him a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. Here, he was just another person, another hand offering help, without titles, without status. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own humanity, the fragility of being seen simply as himself. One afternoon, as he was stacking boxes of food donations, he spotted a familiar figure across the room. Emily was there, her hair pulled back as she helped a young girl find a warm coat among the clothing donations. She looked up and met his gaze, her expression flickering between surprise and caution. Richard felt his heart thud in his chest, but he kept his distance, not wanting to intrude on her work. Later, when she stepped outside for a break, Richard followed, his steps tentative as he approached her. She turned as she heard him, her face guarded yet not unkind. "Richard," she said softly, her tone unreadable. "I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, his voice barely steady. I needed a change," he admitted, struggling to find the words that might explain the transformation he was attempting, even as it felt like the most natural step he could take. "I wanted to do something real, something that mattered, beyond all the barriers I used to hide behind." Emily looked at him, a slight frown creasing her brow. "And you thought coming here would help with that?" He met her gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes clear. "I don't know if it will," he replied honestly. "But I know that I've spent too long seeing the world through the wrong lens. I was so afraid of being hurt, of watching my son be hurt, that I lost sight of what mattered. Being here, It feels like a start. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I may never earn that, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change." For a moment, Emily was silent, her gaze drifting to the distant city skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, reflective. "Richard, I don't know what to make of all this. Seeing you here, trying to help, it does mean something. But trust isn't something that just repairs itself. What you did hurt me. It hurt Thomas. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why you felt the need to do what you did." "I know," he whispered, the regret evident in his tone. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want to live in a way that makes amends, even if you or Thomas never feel able to trust me again." Emily nodded, her expression softening, though a trace of pain remained in her eyes. "It's a start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's going to take more than just gestures, Richard. Real change doesn't come from a single choice. It's a path you have to walk every day." He nodded, her words sinking in with a gravity he had seldom felt before. "Then I'll walk it," he replied, his tone resolute. "I'll keep walking it as long as it takes." Emily looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile appearing, though it was tinged with sadness. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Richard," she said softly. "For your sake, and for Thomas's." With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving Richard alone in the cool afternoon air. He stood there for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. This path he had chosen was one without guarantees. A journey that demanded resilience and patience. He would need to face each day with the humility of someone who had lost what mattered most and was willing to rebuild without expectation. The following weeks saw Richard devoting himself entirely to the work at the outreach center. He found a quiet satisfaction in the routine, in the simple tasks that allowed him to feel useful without the trappings of his former life. He began to understand, in small but profound ways, the lives of the people he encountered. Those who had been bruised by life's hardships, who had faced betrayal, loss, and yet continued forward with resilience. Each story he heard, each connection he made, brought him closer to understanding the depth of his own humanity. And though he rarely saw Emily, the few times their paths did cross, he sensed a shift in her demeanor, a cautious openness that hinted at the possibility of something deeper, though it remained fragile. He didn't push, didn't try to force his way back into her life, but instead allowed the quiet rhythm of his new existence to guide him. As he lay in his modest apartment each night, Richard felt the ache of his losses, but also a strange, quiet peace. He had set out to test someone else's character, but had instead been forced to confront his own. And now, stripped of wealth, of the security he had once valued above all else, he found a freedom he hadn't known was possible. It was a freedom born not of riches, but of the humility to begin anew, one day at a time. The transformation in Richard's life, though modest, began to take root as he settled into his new rhythm. Each morning, he would walk to the outreach center, greeting the familiar faces of volunteers and community members, finding a certain peace in the routine. His days were filled with tasks that once would have seemed trivial to him: stacking shelves, sweeping floors, listening to people's stories. But now, these simple acts felt like a balm to his wounded soul, a way to give without expectation. He rarely thought of his past life with longing. The luxury, the comfort, even the control he had once held over everything around him now felt distant, like a story from another world. He lived in a small apartment near the center, just a single room with the bare essentials, yet it was enough. The emptiness he had once tried to fill with wealth and status was slowly replaced by a sense of purpose, albeit fragile. One morning, as he prepared food packages with another volunteer, he noticed a familiar face moving through the center's hall. Emily was there again, helping a group of young women organize donated clothes. She was a quiet but constant presence at the center, her warmth drawing people to her naturally. Richard couldn't help but watch her from across the room, admiring the ease with which she offered kindness, her every action thoughtful and genuine. Though they hadn't spoken much since their last conversation, they shared an unspoken understanding. Emily was cautious around him, her trust still fragile, but she had allowed him small glimpses of forgiveness. It was these brief interactions that gave him hope, the possibility that, in time, he might earn back the respect he had once taken for granted. As the day wore on, Richard found himself working alongside Emily, both of them sorting through a pile of winter coats that had been donated in preparation for the colder months. They worked in silence at first, the quiet punctuated only by the sounds of their movements. But after a while, Emily glanced over at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "It's surprising, seeing you here every day," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone of curiosity. "Most people wouldn't stick around this long." Richard looked up, meeting her gaze with a mixture of humility and gratitude. "I guess I'm not most people anymore," he replied, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. "This work, it's given me something I didn't even know I was missing. I used to think that power and money could solve everything, that they could protect the people I love. But I see now that real connection, real kindness, those things can't be bought." Emily nodded, her eyes softening as she listened. "People come here because they want to be seen, not judged. They're not looking for handouts. They're looking for dignity, for someone to acknowledge their worth. It's something I've always believed in, but it took me a while to understand it fully." Richard felt a pang of regret as he thought back to the ways he had once viewed people, the assumptions he had made about others based solely on appearances. He had been so focused on protecting himself and his family that he had built walls around his heart, keeping out the very connections he now cherished. "I think I understand that now," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Being here, seeing the strength people have despite everything they go through, it's made me realize how blind I was, how much I missed." Emily looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his words, searching his face for signs of sincerity. "Maybe change doesn't happen overnight," she replied gently, "but it's clear you're trying, Richard. That matters." Her words were a balm, a small yet profound affirmation that he was on the right path. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, and felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that forgiveness, though distant, was not entirely out of reach. Their conversation drifted into lighter topics as they worked, sharing small details about their lives, their pasts, their thoughts on the world. Richard found himself opening up to Emily in ways he hadn't expected, telling her stories from his own struggles, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he was still learning. Emily listened with quiet empathy, offering no judgments, only understanding. As the day drew to a close, Richard felt a sense of peace that was rare and precious. The burdens of his past, though still heavy, seemed to lighten in Emily's presence. He knew that forgiveness, if it came, would be a long journey, and he was prepared to be patient, to allow time and humility to guide him. But in these moments, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps, despite everything, he might still be able to heal the rifts he had caused. Later that evening, as he walked back to his apartment, Richard found himself reflecting on the changes he had undergone. The person he was becoming felt foreign, yet deeply authentic. He no longer needed to wear the mask of wealth and authority, no longer felt the need to protect himself with layers of cynicism and suspicion. He was simply himself, flawed and vulnerable, yet willing to grow. Each day at the outreach center, he learned something new, not only about the people he served, but about himself. He saw the quiet resilience in their faces, heard the stories of survival and hope, and it humbled him. He realized that he was not so different from the people he once looked down upon. He too had suffered, had lost, had made mistakes. In many ways, he was rebuilding his life from the ground up, finding strength in humility and connection. And though he missed the certainty that had once defined him, he found solace in the unpredictability of his new path. He didn't know if he would ever regain Thomas's trust, or if Emily would ever fully forgive him, but he was learning to accept that some things couldn't be forced. All he could do was live each day with integrity, to be the man he wished he had been all along. As he entered his apartment, the quiet surrounding him felt less lonely than it once had. The journey he had started was far from over, but he felt grounded, as though he had finally found a foundation to build upon. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps he could earn back the love and trust he had once taken for granted. The transformation in Richard's life was slow, but genuine. He spent his days at the outreach center, investing himself in the work that had once seemed trivial, and he found solace in the connections he was building, however modest. The life he had built with wealth and power was behind him now, and what lay ahead was simple but meaningful. Each act of kindness, each conversation shared, became a part of his ongoing journey toward healing. It was a life stripped of the trappings he'd once valued, and unexpectedly, it felt whole. As the days turned to weeks, he found a deeper sense of peace, yet he knew he wasn't truly free of his past until he made a final decision, a decision that would mark the closing chapter of his old life. The wealth he had shed had left him feeling lighter, but a portion of it remained, a symbolic tether to his past. It was money that could lift him back into his former lifestyle if he chose, or set him on a path far removed from it. One evening, as he walked back from the center, he paused outside a small park where families gathered, the sound of children's laughter mingling with the crisp night air. He stood there, watching them, feeling the simplicity of their lives, the bonds they shared, bonds that had nothing to do with wealth or power. He knew that his final choice, his true redemption, would mean relinquishing not only his money, but the last pieces of the world he had once held dear. A few days later, Richard made his way to his attorney's office, a place he hadn't visited in months. The familiar walls, lined with leather-bound books and polished mahogany, reminded him of the life he'd left behind, and he felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with determination. He had come here with a purpose, one that would finally close the door on his former life and solidify the new path he was forging. His attorney, a man who had known him through all the highs and lows, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Richard," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "are you certain about this? It's one thing to make donations, but to leave it all behind. This is a monumental decision." Richard nodded, his voice steady. "I've thought about it, and I'm sure. My wealth was supposed to be a legacy for my family, but now I see that it was holding me back. It's time for me to live a life that aligns with what I've come to understand." The attorney sighed, clearly taken aback. "And your son? Have you told him about this?" Richard hesitated, a trace of sadness flickering in his eyes. "Thomas and we haven't spoken much since everything happened, but I believe he'll understand in time. He doesn't need my wealth to build a meaningful life, and I hope that eventually he'll see that my choice was made with him in mind." With a final nod, he signed the necessary papers, transferring the remainder of his wealth into charities, programs that supported education, community building, and shelters for the homeless. The signatures felt like the closing of a chapter, the relinquishing of a burden he had carried for far too long. When he left the office, He felt a strange liberation, a lightness he hadn't known in years. The life that lay before him now was uncharted, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with humility and sincerity. In the days that followed, Richard continued his work at the outreach center with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer Richard Alton, the wealthy businessman, but simply Richard, a man seeking redemption, a man who wanted to give back without expectation. His new life was far from glamorous, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, as he packed up the last of the supplies at the center, he turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway. His son's presence was unexpected, and for a moment, Richard could only stare, a mixture of hope and trepidation welling up inside him. "Thomas," he managed, his voice catching in his throat. I didn't expect to see you here." Thomas stepped forward, his face unreadable but calm. "I heard about what you did," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "The donations, the decision to give everything up. I wanted to see for myself if it was true." Richard nodded, feeling a swell of emotions he struggled to contain. "It's true. I needed to let go of the things that were holding me back, that kept me from being the father you deserved." Thomas's expression softened, though a trace of guardedness remained. "You did all this for me?" Richard took a deep breath, his voice filled with sincerity. "Yes, Thomas. For you, for myself, for the people I've hurt. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to live a life I could be proud of. A life where I could give without strings, without judgment." For a moment, silence hung between them, each man lost in his own thoughts. Then Thomas nodded slowly, his face softening as he took a tentative step forward. "I can see that you're different, Dad," he said, his tone cautious but hopeful. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you did what you did, but I can see that you're trying." Richard's heart swelled with a quiet hope. He met his son's gaze, his voice unsteady. "Thank you, Thomas. That means more to me than you could know." They stood there, a fragile connection forming between them, a tentative step toward rebuilding the trust that had once been shattered. Richard knew that their relationship would take time to heal, that scars remained, but this moment, this shared understanding, was a beginning. As they left the center together, walking side by side under the fading evening light, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. His life was no longer defined by wealth or power, but by the connections he was building, by the humility he was learning to embrace. He was no longer the man he had once been, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he felt ready to face it with an open heart. The weight he had carried for so long was lifted, and as he walked beside his son, he allowed himself to believe that true redemption was within reach. In the weeks following their reconciliation, Richard and Thomas worked tentatively to rebuild their relationship. Their conversations were still cautious, each man feeling his way back to trust. Richard knew he could not erase the past, but he sensed that his actions were beginning to speak louder than the mistakes he had made. His choice to give up his fortune had left a ripple that extended far beyond himself, touching not only his family, but the wider community as well. Richard continued his work at the outreach center, now a familiar and respected figure among the volunteers and those who came seeking help. He found solace in the simple routines, each task grounding him, each connection drawing him further away from the life he had once led. For the first time, he felt as though he were part of something greater than himself, something real and unbreakable. The community, in turn, responded to his sincerity, seeing in him a man changed, a man no longer hidden behind wealth or status. One brisk autumn morning, Richard was sorting through donations when a young man he had helped weeks ago came up to him, offering a shy smile. The man, Caleb, had been through hard times, sleeping in shelters and struggling to find steady work. But with Richard's encouragement, he had recently secured a part-time job and was beginning to get back on his feet. Caleb held out a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth, extending it to Richard with a proud but hesitant expression. "I wanted to give you something," Caleb said, his voice quiet yet steady. "You've helped me more than you know, and I can't offer much. But this is from the heart." Richard took the bundle, feeling a pang of emotion as he unwrapped it to reveal a small, handmade wooden carving of a tree. The craftsmanship was rough, but there was a simple beauty to it, a detail in each branch that spoke of Caleb's sincerity. Richard looked up, his eyes misting as he held the carving gently. "Thank you, Caleb," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "This means more to me than you could ever know." The young man nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You gave me hope when I didn't think I had any left," he said simply, and with a final nod he walked away, leaving Richard alone with the small carving cradled in his hands. It was moments like these, Richard realized, that defined the life he was now building. The connections he was forming, each one genuine, built on mutual respect and compassion, were the true wealth he had been seeking. He thought back to the person he had once been, a man encased in armor, made of suspicion and pride, and he felt a surge of gratitude that he had been given the chance to start anew. That evening, as he sat in his modest apartment, the carving resting on the small table by his bed, Richard thought of Thomas and the journey they had been on together. He had underestimated his son's resilience, his capacity to forgive, just as he had underestimated his own ability to change. It wasn't an easy journey, and he knew that every step required humility, patience, and a willingness to accept that healing took time. But for the first time, he felt hopeful that he could build something lasting with his son. A few days later, Thomas invited Richard to join him and Emily for dinner at their apartment. Richard's heart raced at the invitation, a mixture of excitement and nervousness filling him. It would be the first time he had seen Emily since their conversation at the outreach center, and he knew that her presence would test the progress he had made, the sincerity of his transformation. When he arrived, he was greeted warmly by Thomas, who led him into the cozy apartment filled with the scent of homemade stew. Emily appeared from the kitchen, a soft smile on her face as she met his gaze. Richard felt a surge of gratitude, sensing that he too, although the wounds might not yet be fully healed, there was a genuine openness in her demeanor. As they sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed naturally, each of them cautious but gradually relaxing into the familiarity they had once shared. They spoke of the outreach center, of the lives Richard had touched, and Emily listened with quiet attentiveness, her expression thoughtful. "Richard," she said at one point, her voice gentle but firm, "I can see that you've changed. I didn't think it was possible, to be honest. But I see it now, in the way you talk about people, the way you approach life. It's good to see." Her words, spoken without embellishment, felt like a balm to the doubts that still lingered in his mind. He looked at her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, Emily. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it more than you know." The evening continued, each conversation deepening their shared understanding, each laugh and story building a bridge that spanned the hurt and mistrust that had once divided them. Richard felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a quiet joy that seemed to grow with each moment they shared. This was the family he had nearly lost, the life he had almost destroyed, and now here they were, finding their way back together. After dinner, Thomas walked Richard to the door, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity, "I'm proud of you. I don't think I ever told you that, but I am. Seeing you here, seeing the way you've worked to change, it means a lot. Richard's heart swelled, and he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his own voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Thomas. That means everything to me. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that." They embraced, a bond rekindled, no longer marked by unspoken suspicions or hidden tests, but by trust and mutual respect. As Richard left the apartment, walking down the quiet street, he felt a profound gratitude settle over him. The journey he had embarked on, filled with hardship and introspection, had brought him here to this moment of quiet triumph. And as he walked under the soft glow of streetlights, he allowed himself to believe that, finally, he had found the peace he had been searching for all along. The following week, Richard found himself standing in the park where he had last spoken to Thomas about the harm he had caused. The air was cool, the faint scent of fallen leaves mingling with the earthy smell of damp grass. He had come here at Thomas's request, a simple message inviting him to meet, with no further explanation. Richard felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation as he waited, the weight of their journey together lingering in his mind. It had been a long road, and he knew that there were still unspoken words between them. Soon he saw Thomas approaching, his face serious but calm. As he drew nearer, Richard offered a tentative smile, unsure of what his son had to say. Thomas returned the gesture, a small nod of acknowledgement as he came to stand beside his father. They both stood in silence for a moment, gazing at the trees as they swayed gently in the autumn breeze. "Thanks for meeting me here," Thomas said, breaking the silence, his voice thoughtful. "Of course, Thomas," Richard replied, his tone gentle, as though careful not to disrupt the delicate atmosphere between them. "I'm glad you asked." Thomas took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the distant treetops. "I wanted to talk to you about everything. I know we've had dinners, and I can see the changes you've made, but I needed to really understand, Dad. I needed to hear it from you." Richard nodded, a sense of solemnity settling over him. "I understand, son, and I'll tell you anything you want to know." Thomas paused, his brow furrowing as he chose his words carefully. "Why did you go so far? Why did you think you needed to put Emily through all that, to put me through it? I've spent so long trying to make sense of it, and I still don't fully understand." Richard felt the weight of his son's question, the same question he had been asking himself in the quiet moments of reflection that had defined his life in recent months. He took a moment, inhaling deeply, allowing the crisp air to calm him before he spoke. "Thomas, when I first started this test, it was because I thought I was protecting you. I was convinced that I could see things you couldn't, that I needed to protect you from what I'd been through, from the people I'd seen value money over love. I didn't want you to be hurt, and I thought I could shield you by judging Emily for myself." Thomas listened intently, his expression somber. "But it wasn't just about protecting me, was it?" Richard's eyes fell to the ground, shame settling over him as he acknowledged the truth he had avoided for so long. "No, it wasn't," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It was about my own fears, my own inability to trust. I had lost sight of what it meant to believe in people, to let them show me who they truly were without my interference. I thought I was acting out of love, but in reality I was acting out of fear. And that fear led me to hurt the people I care about most." Thomas's face softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his features. "Dad, I know you thought you were doing the right thing, but I need you to understand that love isn't something that can be tested. It's something you have to choose to believe in, even when you don't have all the answers." Richard felt a wave of emotion rise within him, the truth of his son's words resonating deeply. He had spent so much of his life constructing barriers, trying to shield himself and those he loved from the uncertainties of the world. But in doing so, he had missed the very essence of what it meant to love unconditionally, to trust without guarantees, to give without expecting a return. "I see that now," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm so sorry, Thomas. I know that my actions nearly destroyed what we had. I don't expect forgiveness to come easily, but I want you to know that I'm committed to rebuilding that trust, one day at a time." Thomas nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "It's not easy, Dad, but I can see that you're trying. I can see that you're willing to do the work, and that gives me hope." They stood in silence for a few moments, each man processing the significance of the conversation they had just shared. The weight of their past mistakes, their shared pain, seemed to lift ever so slightly, leaving space for a new beginning, however fragile. After a while, Thomas spoke again, his tone softer. "There's something I want you to see," he said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small, worn envelope. He handed it to Richard, a hint of hesitation in his gesture. Richard took the envelope, curiosity flickering in his gaze. He opened it carefully, revealing a faded photograph of a young boy with a wide, innocent smile, holding his mother's hand. The boy was Thomas, and the woman in the photo was Richard's late wife, a memory he hadn't revisited in years. The image stirred something deep within him, a reminder of the love that had once filled his life, a love he had almost lost sight of in his quest for security and control. "This was taken a few months before Mom passed," Thomas explained quietly. "I look at it sometimes to remind myself of who I want to be, the kind of love I want to have in my life. I thought, maybe you could use it as a reminder too." Richard felt his throat tighten as he held the photo, the weight of the past settling over him like a gentle embrace. He looked up at Thomas, his vision blurred with unshed tears, and managed a small, grateful nod. "Thank you, Thomas," he whispered. This means more to me than I can say." They stood together, sharing a quiet understanding that needed no words. For the first time in years, Richard felt the full depth of his son's love, a love that had withstood the storms of betrayal and doubt. It was a love that had found its way back, stronger and more resilient, because it had been tested and endured. As they walked away from the park together, Richard felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the journey wasn't over, that there were still wounds to heal, still steps to take, but he also knew that he was no longer walking that path alone. With each step they took, side by side, he felt the unspoken bond between them grow, a bond built not on wealth or expectation, but on trust, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of love. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, Richard knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. The days that followed were filled with a quiet rhythm, each one carrying Richard further from his old life and closer to a newfound sense of belonging. He continued his work at the outreach center, finding meaning in the small moments, a smile from a stranger he'd helped, a heartfelt thank you from someone who had received his assistance. His life, once defined by grandeur and wealth, now revolved around simple, honest connections. He had no illusions about the road ahead, but each step felt grounded, real. And for the first time, he felt content with that simplicity. His relationship with Thomas, too, found a new footing. They spoke often, sometimes about memories of the past, sometimes about the future they were building, and sometimes about nothing at all, simply enjoying each other's company without expectation or tension. The air between them was clear, the lingering strain from Richard's past mistakes no longer hanging over their every interaction. It was a bond forged anew, one that hadn't erased the scars, but had woven them into a story of resilience and understanding. One chilly afternoon, Richard was packing up boxes of winter coats with another volunteer when he noticed Emily standing in the doorway, her gaze fixed on him with a soft expression he hadn't seen in months. She approached slowly, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her breath visible in small clouds in the cold air. Richard straightened, a smile touching his lips as he watched her draw near. "Emily," he greeted warmly, the ease in his tone a testament to the progress they'd made. "It's good to see you." She returned his smile, though her gaze held a thoughtful depth. "It's good to see you too, Richard," she replied. After a moment, she gestured toward the boxes. "You're making a real difference here. People talk about you, you know. They say you're one of the kindest volunteers." Richard felt a warmth spread through him, a mixture of pride and humility. "I just try to help," he said simply. "This place has given me more than I could ever give back. It's taught me things about myself I didn't know, about how much kindness can mean to someone." Emily nodded, her eyes softening. "I can see that. I think everyone can." She paused, her expression shifting to one of quiet sincerity. "I wanted to tell you, Richard, I've forgiven you. It wasn't easy, and there were times I didn't think I could, but seeing the changes you've made, the way you've embraced this life with honesty, it's enough." Her words struck a deep chord within him, a feeling of relief and gratitude surging through him. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I know I didn't deserve your forgiveness, but it means everything to me that you've given it. I can't tell you how much this journey, these past months, have changed me." Emily smiled, a gentle warmth in her gaze. "I can see that, Richard. I think you found something real here, something that was missing before." She glanced around the bustling room, the energy of the people and the atmosphere of camaraderie evident. "I think you belong here." Her words hung in the air, resonating with a truth Richard hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He did belong here. This world, this work, this sense of being part of something greater than himself, it had filled the emptiness that his wealth and control had never been able to touch. He no longer craved the security of his old life. Instead, he found peace in being vulnerable, in connecting with others without the armor he had once relied upon. As they stood in comfortable silence, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to him with a faint smile. "This is something I thought you might appreciate," she said softly. "It's from a friend of mine, a writer. She wanted to thank you for all the support you've given here." Richard took the envelope, his curiosity piqued. Inside, he found a handwritten letter, simple and heartfelt, expressing gratitude for his work, for his kindness, and for the impact he had unknowingly had on the lives of so many. Each word felt like a reminder of the life he was building, a life rooted in empathy and humility. He looked back at Emily, his eyes misty with gratitude. "Thank you for this," he said quietly. "It means more than you could know." They shared a smile, a connection forged not out of necessity or expectation, but out of mutual respect and understanding. Emily's presence, once a source of conflict and mistrust, now felt like a testament to the resilience of forgiveness, the power of change. That evening, as Richard walked home, he reflected on how far he had come. His old life, once filled with luxury and influence, felt like a distant memory, a shell he had shed along with the fears that had once governed his actions. Now, he was simply Richard, a man trying to live with integrity, to make amends for the mistakes of his past, and to embrace each new day with humility. When he arrived at his apartment, he placed the letter from Emily's friend on his bedside table, next to the carving Caleb had given him. These small tokens, humble yet profound, represented the wealth he now cherished, the gratitude of those he had helped, the forgiveness he had earned, and the sense of purpose he had discovered. They were reminders that true worth was not found in material possessions, but in the connections we build, the lives we touch, and the love we nurture. As he prepared for bed, Richard felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him, a quiet contentment that had eluded him for much of his life. He knew that the journey was not yet complete, that there would always be more to learn, more ways to grow. But for the first time, he felt that he was on the right path, a path that led not to power or prestige, but to fulfillment and authenticity. In the quiet of his room, he thought of Thomas, of Emily, of the friends he had made at the outreach center, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had given him a second chance, had shown him that redemption was not a single act, but a series of choices, a commitment to live each day with compassion and humility. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he had finally found his place in the world, not as the man he had once been, but as the man he was becoming. A few weeks had passed since Emily's quiet gesture of forgiveness and the heartfelt conversations with Thomas. Richard had continued to pour himself into his work at the outreach center, his days filled with moments of connection and humility that reminded him of the life he now cherished. Yet, as he settled into this new rhythm, something unexpected arrived, bringing with it a flood of memories and a profound sense of closure he hadn't realized he still needed. One evening, after a long day of sorting donations, Richard returned home to find a small, unmarked package on his doorstep. Curious, he brought it inside, setting it on his table before peeling away the wrapping. Inside, he found a worn, leather-bound journal with a note attached. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his own, though faintly aged and barely familiar. It read simply, "To the man I thought I had to be, may you find peace in the journey you've chosen." A wave of recognition swept over him. Years ago, at the height of his career, he had begun writing in this journal, pouring his ambitions, fears, and plans into its pages. It had been a time when he believed he could control every aspect of his life, a time when he had valued power and security above all else. The journal had been a confidant of sorts, a place where he could lay bare his innermost thoughts without fear of judgment. And yet, somewhere along the way, he had abandoned it, shoving it into the recesses of a forgotten drawer when he no longer felt the need for reflection. Now, the journal felt like a relic of another life. Its presence stirred something deep within him, a need to confront the man he had once been, to reconcile with the choices he had made. He sat down, flipping through the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the words he had written in his former voice. Words that now felt distant and foreign. Page after page, he read accounts of meetings, strategies for growth, meticulous plans for securing the future he had believed would bring happiness. But then, as he neared the journal center, the tone shifted, and he found himself drawn to a passage he had written in a moment of vulnerability. The passage read, "I am afraid that all of this is for nothing, that in my quest to protect what I love, I'm losing sight of what truly matters. I don't know if Thomas will understand why I do this, or if he will one day resent me for it. But I feel trapped, unable to stop, unable to trust anyone else with this responsibility. I wonder if I am making a mistake, if this life is becoming more of a prison than a sanctuary." Richard's hands shook slightly as he absorbed the words. The weight of his own doubts, so carefully hidden for years, now laid bare before him. He had never allowed himself to acknowledge these fears, had buried them under layers of control and precision, convinced that his family's safety depended on his strength alone. Yet here, written in his own hand, was the truth he had denied. He had been afraid, not just of failure, but of love, of trust, of vulnerability. He turned to the next page and found another entry. This one scrawled hurriedly, as if in a moment of desperation. What if I am wrong? What if, in trying to protect, I am pushing them away? Thomas is his own man, but I keep forgetting that. I fear the world will hurt him, that he will suffer as I have, but in shielding him, I wonder if I am doing him harm. I wish I could let go, but I don't know how. The words struck him deeply, a painful reminder of the struggles that had shaped his actions. He realized now that his life had been dominated by these fears, his need for control a thin veil over the insecurities he had been too proud to face. But in these moments, reading his past self's confessions, he felt a strange sense of empathy for the man he had once been. He understood now, with the clarity of hindsight, that he had been lost, trapped in a cycle of fear and ambition that had blinded him to the love and trust he could have embraced all along. As he reached the final pages, he found a note that he had written to himself, a letter of sorts, addressed to the future. It read, "If you ever reach this point again, if you ever find yourself doubting, remember why you started. Remember that love cannot be bought, that trust cannot be forced. If you want Thomas to be happy, if you want peace, let go. Trust him. Trust yourself." The simple words held a depth of meaning that left Richard speechless, a wisdom he hadn't grasped until it was nearly too late. In that moment, he felt a wave of release, a letting go of the burdens he had carried, not just in his actions, but in his heart. The journey he had taken to find forgiveness, to rebuild his relationship with Thomas and Emily, had brought him to this place of understanding. He saw now that his transformation wasn't simply a matter of making different choices. It was about embracing the vulnerability he had once feared. That evening, Richard closed the journal with a sense of peace. The journey he had undertaken, the sacrifices he had made, the trust he had rebuilt, it was all a testament to the strength he had found not in control, but in surrender. He felt lighter, as though he had shed the last remnants of his past, emerging as a man defined not by wealth or influence, but by love, humility, and forgiveness. In the days that followed, he kept the journal close, a reminder of the man he had been and the man he had become. He shared parts of it with Thomas, showing him the fears he had once held, the reasons behind the choices that had nearly torn them apart. Their conversations grew deeper, each revelation strengthening the bond they were rebuilding, each shared memory a testament to the resilience of family. And though he knew that there were still steps to take, still moments of healing that would come in time, Richard felt, for the first time, that he was whole. Richard sat on a worn wooden bench in the same park where he had once waited, disguised as a stranger, to test Emily's character. The autumn leaves carpeted the ground in hues of amber and russet, and a gentle breeze rustled through the branches above, creating a soft, familiar murmur that seemed to echo the journey he had undertaken. Today, he was here not as a man driven by suspicion or fear, but as someone who had embraced humility, someone who had found peace in the unlikeliest of places. As he looked around, he saw Thomas and Emily approaching, their figures framed by the fading light of the late afternoon sun. They walked hand in hand, their faces soft with warmth and contentment, a stark contrast to the tension and mistrust that had once clouded their lives. Richard rose, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude as they drew closer, the small distance between them closing in a matter of steps. "Hi, Dad," Thomas greeted, his tone carrying a familiarity that made Richard's chest tighten with emotion. It had been a long time since his son had called him that with such openness, and the simple word felt like a balm, soothing the last vestiges of pain from their past. "Hello, Thomas. Emily," he replied, nodding to each of them. His voice was steady, but the hint of a tremor betrayed the depth of his feelings. "Thank you for meeting me here. I wanted us to share this moment together." They sat beside him on the bench, the three of them looking out at the trees that had borne witness to so much of Richard's journey. A quiet understanding settled over them, a peace that needed no words to be felt. After a few moments, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to Richard with a gentle smile. "I found this a few days ago," she explained softly. "It seems like it might mean something to you." Richard took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the worn paper as he opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in his own hand. He recognized it immediately. It was a note he had written to himself at the start of the journey that had transformed his life. He had meant to revisit it once he was certain that he had made the right choice, once he believed he had truly changed. And now here it was, a reminder of the promises he had made to himself, promises he had finally kept. He read silently, his heart swelling with each line. The words were simple but honest, a reflection of the man he had once been and the man he had hoped to become. "Remember," it read, "that love is a gift, not something to be tested or controlled. Trust in others, trust in yourself, and you will find the peace you seek." Richard felt a tear slip down his cheek, and he brushed it away quickly, looking up at Thomas and Emily with a newfound clarity in his gaze. "I wrote this a long time ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know then if I would ever find the strength to live by these words. But being here with you both, it feels like I finally have." Thomas reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "You have, Dad. You truly have." His tone held a sincerity that made Richard's heart swell with gratitude. It was a confirmation of all he had hoped to achieve, a validation of the path he had chosen, no matter how difficult it had been. Emily nodded, her eyes shining with quiet approval. "You've shown us what real change looks like, Richard, and I think that means more than anything you could have ever done before." They sat in silence for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts, yet bound by the shared understanding that had emerged from the trials they had endured together. Richard felt as if he was seeing his son and Emily for the first time, not as subjects of his protection, but as individuals with lives, dreams, and a love that stood strong in the face of adversity. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Thomas leaned forward, his expression contemplative. "Dad," he said slowly, "there's something I want you to know. Emily and we've talked a lot about the future, about what we want. And we'd like you to be part of it, not as the man you used to be, but as the person you are now." Richard's breath caught, the invitation hitting him with a profound force. He looked at his son, his heart pounding, and managed a small nod. "That means more to me than you'll ever know, Thomas. I promise to be there to support you both, without any conditions, without any expectations." Thomas smiled, a warmth in his gaze that reflected the love and forgiveness that had finally found its place between them. "We know, Dad. We trust you." The three of them rose from the bench as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. They walked together side by side, Richard's heart brimming with a sense of fulfillment he had never known. This journey, marked by mistakes, sacrifices, and moments of self-discovery, had led him here to a place of acceptance and unconditional love. As they left the park, Richard took one last glance at the bench, the spot where he had once sat in disguise, weighed down by fears and insecurities. He felt no attachment to that man anymore. He had shed those layers and emerged as someone new, someone unencumbered by the burdens of the past. With Thomas and Emily by his side, Richard stepped forward into the future, no longer driven by fear, but by a quiet strength, a belief in the beauty of second chances. The journey had been long, and the path had often seemed unclear, But he had found his way, not alone, but with the support of those who mattered most. In that moment, he understood that true redemption lay not in grand gestures or unyielding control, but in the simple act of letting go, in trusting those he loved and allowing himself to be vulnerable. He had come full circle, not to the man he had once been, but to the man he had always aspired to be. As they walked into the fading light, a quiet joy settled over him, a sense of completion, of harmony. He knew that life would bring new challenges, that mistakes would still be made, but he also knew that he would face them with integrity, humility, and love. And that, he realized, was all he had ever needed. In the end, he was not the man who had controlled his family's future from a distance. He was a father, a friend, a man who had found peace not in perfection, but in the willingness to grow and change. And as they disappeared into the twilight, Richard felt the quiet triumph of a life transformed, the beauty of a journey that had brought him, finally, to a place he could call home. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.